Hey, I'm Chris, and you're listening to Into the Cauldron. Today's talk is with Kerry Wisner. He's one of my absolute favourite authors. He's written The Willow Path and The Haunt of the Moon, both in the Gaessa Trilogy. His third book, The Art, is coming out fairly soon. Not sure an exact date, but fairly soon. Today, we are going to be talking, as you can see, it's quite a big one. It's 2.5 hours long, and we talk about everything from what traditional witchcraft is, hermetics, his own path, trading with Grandma Julie and Sybil Leek, and everything from hauntings to new age crystals, everything, and also how traditional witchcraft works, why you should do it, and really if you should be involved in witchcraft at all anyway, right? So if that's something that interests you, keep listening, and don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and everything else, and I'll see you soon.
There we go. Okay,
great. Brilliant. How you doing?
Good. Tired. Very hot here. Very hot.
Yeah. We've been going through a couple of heat waves too. It's been kind of just horrible. It's a lot of fun time for me, you know.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I usually like the heat, but this has been a little bit much. It's been much. So
yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I'm always much more of I'm much more of a kind of a fall winter guy.
Yeah,
it's when it feels a bit more natural to me, but you know.
You're in London? Are you in London or
close enough? I'm in Kent, so I'm like half an hour outside of London, more or less. It's the southeast, so I'm sort of near the coastline, pretty much.
Nice.
But we're still getting all the heat waves and stuff from London, you know. So
yeah, I've always wanted to go, and I've never been to Great Britain, and I've always wanted to go. Always.
Yeah,
I've had the chance.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. I love it here, especially the folklore. I mean, mostly the folklore, right? That's what attracts me to it. But still, anyway, we're working with it. But yeah, thank you for coming on. Thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast. It's really great.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, I hadn't really prepared. I wasn't sure what to expect. Let's see, what exactly you want to know. I've been involved in the occult arts, the magical arts for most of my life, realistically. I'd say I got introduced early in my teens. I picked up a couple books when I was about 12 years old and on ESP and ghost hunting. I was just a kid. Yeah. And it really fascinated me. And unbeknownst to me at the time, my father was very involved in all of this stuff. He'd kept a secret from the rest of the family. But when I mentioned to him that that I was reading these books, he started passing me other occult books. And he was a member of AMORC, the Rosicrucians out in California. And again, he didn't tell anybody until me, and then he started showing me some of the material. And he really was the one that introduced me to all of this. And as time went on, in my early teens, I started reading quite a bit on folklore, magic. I ran across, this was the early 70s. So this is about the time when the occult explosion was very big. Sybil Leek was on the scene. Paul Huston's book, Mastering Witchcraft, was out there. Stuart Farrar's book, What Witches Do. Yeah. And I picked up all of those at the age of about 13 and started reading like crazy and started practicing these different techniques. I was really taken aback by, taken with Sybil Leek's material. I really liked her approach. It seemed very natural and wholesome and realistic. And so I began reading her material quite a bit. And I took her correspondence courses in astrology dynamics, went through all three of those courses, began corresponding with her and her son, Julian. They were living in Florida, began corresponding with them. And eventually I was living in Michigan, which is the Midwest of the US. And at age 17, just before 18, got on a bus and went to California. I said, thanks, Dad, and took off. I was a hippie out there running record stores and had my own apartment. And I, at one point, decided I wanted to really learn and get involved in real witchcraft as much as I could. So I wrote to Sybil directly, and I really didn't think she'd write back. I mean, this woman was world famous. This was the late 70s at this point, but she did. She wrote back, and she explained that she couldn't take students on at that time herself. Little did I know, apparently she was dying of cancer at the time. But she gave me the address of Isaac Bonowitz. He was a rather famous occultist here in the U.S. at the time, and he was living on the West Coast. And so I wrote to him, and him and his wife were very gracious, invited me up to Berkeley to their home. And I went a couple times and did a couple full moon rituals with them. But he, in time, introduced me to Julie. I told him what I was looking for. And Julie, I'm not going to give her last name, but Julie, I've later, just recently found a lot of people have come forward saying they, is this Julie so-and-so? Because apparently their family is still very active. But Julie was the matriarch of a family claiming to be family tradition in Basque traditional witchcraft. And I remember my first meeting with her was very tenuous. She was very unsure of me. I was young. I was about 20, 21. And she, after much back and forth, she decided to take me on to be a student of hers while she looked for a coven that would better suit my needs, because hers was family and I wasn't part of the family. Little did I know at the time that she too was dying of cancer. I had no idea. But she took me on, and every week, sometimes twice a week, she'd have me over to her house, and sometimes she'd take her and her magical partner, who went by the name of Don, would take me out to different places in the San Francisco Bay Area and different bookstores, out on field trips into the mountains to hunt for herbs. But they spent quite a bit of time with me and taught me a lot over the year and a half that I was with her. And she was getting sicker and sicker. And eventually she was introducing me to a number of different groups, and eventually found a group that she thought was very reputable, was in line with what her teachings were. And so she introduced me to them, and they did in time initiate me. And then shortly after that, she passed on. And I was with that group for a good 10 years and eventually became the high priest or master, whatever you want to call it, of the group. It was more Wiccan based rather than traditional witchcraft, where Julie was traditional. Yeah. And eventually I left that group around 1990 and went out on my own. I was very interested in Hermetics and also in ancient Egyptian religion and magic. And so I stepped away from the whole witchcraft situation and paganism situation and focused on my own training and development through academic texts. And I set up in my house in the attic an Egyptian temple and really researched the magic techniques based on temple inscriptions. I focused largely on the temple of Edfu and Dendera because they're some of the best preserved. Taught myself how to read French so I could read the French transliterations of archaeologists' records from Dendera, because the French were really ahead of their time as far compared to English speaking. And it was a lot of work, but a lot of fun. And in time, I started up a correspondence course called Aket Hutaru, which means Radiant Place of the Goddess Hathor. And I had that going for quite a number of years. I wrote 3 very in-depth courses. All of them I documented very carefully. I had a number of Egyptologists contact me privately who wanted to read the material, and they were very impressed with the level that I had reached with it, because I don't have a degree in this. I'm not going to lie. I'm not Egyptologist in any way. I'm an occultist. And so I did that for quite a while. And yet it seemed like there's something missing, something more I needed. So I dug deeper into Hermetics. And in particular, I came across, I was very impressed by Melita Denning and Osborne Phillips' books, The Magical Philosophy. It's a 5-volume set put out in the 70s and 80s. And I happened upon a group through the internet that was a closed order, Hermetic order, didn't charge money or anything like that, and began training with them. And I flew to, they were out in Minneapolis, and I flew out there several times, drove out there a few times. We corresponded back and forth and went through the initiation ceremonies, eventually made it to what they call Third Hall, a College of Thrones. And basically it's the adept level for that particular system. So my background's really varied. A lot of Hermetics, ceremonial magic, strong ancient Egyptian info. But what I really enjoy the most, I think, is the basic, realistic, practical approach that traditional witchcraft has and takes toward its art. And the reason I say that, I think what happened was late, around 2010, I and my wife, we had a series of events happen that basically we decided to move away from the city. We hated it, hated the city and all of that. Kind of just gave up on society, moved out to a piece of land that we had bought, 22 acres deep in the mountains of New Hampshire here in New England. And we started building a cabin that's off grid. We're still out there. But what happened was when you get out there, something changes. There's something in the mountains here. There's something in the land here that is primal and real. And it really spoke to a lot of my training with Julie. And so I began really focusing on that. And it almost emerged organically from my training. And that's where the books, The Willow Path, came from, Horns of the Moon. And now the third book is The Art. And, I'm now in my mid-60s, and I'm going, I have all this stuff in my head. I wanted to get it out into a form that's usable and real. I'm not saying it is the way. I'm not saying this is it, guys. Anything else is wrong. I just wanted to get out what I've learned over 50 plus years of practicing magical arts, put it into some kind of form so that other people could pick it up and get what they can from it. And if they can get something from it, great. Otherwise, leave it, set it aside, and maybe come back to it later. Yeah. So what I practice now really is a combination of the three, but I try to distill it down into very basic, realistic terms. Traditional witchcraft really started, in my opinion, when you look at folkloric magic. I mean, it was the magic of the people, the common folk. These are people that are living close to the land. They were out there tilling the fields, killing the chickens for dinner. It was in survival mode every day. And so people look at this traditional witchcraft and they say, well, could this really be real? Does it work? These people wouldn't have used it if it didn't. They didn't have the time to. This was another tool for them. Just like they had to get the seeds in the ground at a certain time, they knew that if they did certain spells and rituals, it would have a certain effect. And that's what I like about practical traditional witchcraft, is that it's where the rubber hits the road type of magic. It's not high and ethereal. It can be, and it has those elements in it. It absolutely does, because the traditional work, which is working with the spirits and forces within the land and within nature. And it has its moments where you're working with beings that are not normally perceived by most people. But the reality is that it is down and dirty. Let's go out there and make this happen, because if we don't, we may not survive tomorrow. And that's what I like about this, is that it works. It really works on a practical level. Yeah. So that's a kind of a quick rundown of my history.
I mean, honestly, now it's such an amazing. You explained it so well. I kind of want to keep it in. You were saying hey, let's go through, let's cut it, and then we're like, I'll start here, and then we'll keep going. But now I'm just like, you know what? We're into it. I love it. Okay. I want to keep it in, actually. But so I mean, I'm really curious. So all I guess the culmination of everything that you've learned, of course, that's really what constitutes, I guess, the Willow Path, in a manner of speaking, right? Or is the Willow Path more sort of specific to your teaching, your learnings from Julie, do you think?
Well, Julie was the one that introduced me to that name. She called it the Willow Path. And she explained that what that means is that the witch knows how to bend and shape reality the way one can bend or shape the osiers of a willow. And I always remembered that, and I've never seen it anywhere else. I have any references to it other than Julie. And I will have to say that she was the time I was with her was a tremendous impact on my training. I look back now at my moral code, how I approach the art, and I find that I still see that it really rests firmly with the teachings Julie gave. She didn't go, I mean, I was with her for about a year and a half. We did ritual. We talked about magic quite a bit, but she didn't go into the depth that I think I've gotten from the other traditions.
Yeah.
But she gave me a good solid foundation of the basics of what it is, from its approach to sexuality, to everything, to just its approach to living. And for her and her family, it is, or it was and still is, their way of living and understanding reality. And that's, so the Willow path really does resonate with her, but I did incorporate other things, which I know Julie would be fine with. I know she would have. She did a lot of her own family stuff that she showed me, that she took me into family rituals with them. She, at the same time, she had a number of students that she had us read Hermetics. She one of her favorite books was Conway's Ritual Magic. She loved the Victorian book, The Kabbalion. She was very eclectic in that way. And so the question becomes in my mind is, where did her family teachings start, and where did the other stuff that she learned come in? And I'll never know. All I know is she was highly respected in the pagan community back when she was alive. And as I mentioned again, since these books have been written, I've had people contact me and they say, "Are you referring to Julie so-and-so?" And they in fact were students of hers or had become students of the family that apparently is still active today. But again, I'm reluctant to give a name unless they give.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I understand that completely. It's the thing that always interested me, and actually the thing that attracted me to Horns of the Moon in particular, when I was looking at just the Gaessa trilogy as a whole, really. The fact that it's Basque, or that there is influences of Basque witchcraft, is absolutely fascinating to me, because Basque is one of those very kind of obscure, fascinating cultures in Europe, because it's one of the only cultures that we have that isn't a Proto-Indo-European or an Indo-European culture. It predates the Indo-European arrival. So it's actually one of the only cultures in the entirety of Europe, even from a linguistic perspective, if you take the language itself, but also just the culture. It's part of Old World Europe. So it's something that was existing and doing its thing and was around, even purely from a linguistic perspective, before any Indo-European arrivals. And there's been a ton of work done, especially in sort of archaeological circles and like linguistic circles and all that kind of thing, in recent years, about sort of tracing the whole, we call it the Urmant hypothesis, but tracing the homeland of the Indo-Europeans and where they came from and all of the kind of changes and things that they brought. But one of the biggest changes that we see, especially in religion, is a lot of the deities, a lot of the spirits that were brought in by Indo-Europeans are predominantly more masculine entities, whereas a lot of the older or Old World Europe are generally more kind of feminine goddess types. And it's that there are nuances to that. There probably would have been masculine deities in Old World Europe, absolutely. And it has the whole idea has kind of been accosted by radical feminism in some ways as well, where sort of it's going back to that original matriarch idea, which I don't fully believe in. But it does just fascinate me that the Willow path, especially if it is a survival of sort of Basque culture or any kind of insight into Basque culture, then we are potentially looking at something that is pre-Indo-European. In its lineage, which is absolutely fascinating to me.
I'm going to say I honestly don't know how much of what Julie taught was from traditional Basque teachings. I really don't know. I mean, here's a woman that was living in 20th century California. I mean, this was not
sure.
And she was well read in a number of occult philosophies and practices. But there were certain things that appeared to be, from my point of view, indicative of her family, which I haven't seen elsewhere until recently. For example, in her family, the primary place of practice is the hearth. The hearth was everything to them. And they saw it as the point of contact between worlds. So it's the point where you have all four elements come together, whether it's the wood, which would be earth, making the fire, the smoke that goes up the chimney, the water in the cauldron that's boiling over it, and the light that is spirit. Julie everything was centered around the hearth. And I'd never seen that until I came across Gemma Gray's book, Traditional Witchcraft, a Cornish Book of Ways.
Book of Ways, yeah.
Yes, and she talked about the same thing, and I thought, isn't that intriguing that finally, after I've been doing this for 30, 40 years, I found this book that said basically the same thing. But Julie had been doing it back in the 70s and before. And I've not seen any Wiccan covens that stress that. It's
interesting. I think. I mean, the hearth, even as a symbol, right? So even if you take sort of all of the sort of esoteric imagery and things out of it for a second, it's the meeting place of the house, right? Like the hearth is effectively, at least in as you were saying earlier, right? If we look into sort of more traditional witchcraft as it's seen as sort of the folk witchcraft, like it's very much the witchcraft of the people. The hearth, even back in medieval, Renaissance, all those kind of periods, the hearth was the meeting place of the family. It was the place where every member came together. They ate, they drank, they said stories. In fact, even you could even argue actually that the hearth is almost intrinsically connected to traditional witchcraft as a whole, because it's the place where knowledge is transferred. It's the place where your grandparents, whatever, tell you stories around the hearth on like a cold winter's night, right? It's the place where you learn new things from your family members, and it's where traditions are passed on. So I think that it's something that continually is a powerful force in any kind of witchcraft. But I know what you mean. I haven't seen it outside of any sort of traditional witchcraft circles, and it is something that is unfortunately, I think, lost in sort of neo-pagan ideas or any sort of Wiccan roots, because it just doesn't really appear as much, which is just kind of mind-boggling to me that it's such like a pivotal point of traditional witchcraft that it's kind of been lost in the neo-pagan areas. But
and the hearth has always been seen as the center of the home. It's been seen with the house spirit was centered, and for her, all of her magic was done at the hearth, all of it. Over and over, she would take me to her hearth. We did, what was it? It was a full moon in October near Samhain. And I normally would not have been allowed because it was a family, but she had me as a student and she thought it'd be good. So they had me in there and they did everything. They had one big room that was empty except for the hearth, and all the tools were set at the hearth, and it was all centered around the hearth. And again, as far as other Basque connections, I don't even know if that's Basque. That was indicative of her tradition, but
it's very sort of traditional folk witchcraft in general.
So I honestly don't know how much carried through from her family over the generations. I really don't know. What I can say is that what she taught worked. It was real. It worked. It was very, very good material. I still have all my notes from all those years ago. And I was really meticulous about it. I'm kind of proud of myself that I still have my letters from Sybil Leek. I've got stuff from when I was a kid. I'm a pack rat. The place is packed with notes and piles of paper.
You should see my temple room. It's just I have like little post-it notes all over the wall and everything. It's one of those things. I think when you're in sort of I guess what I don't know what you would describe it as, like a mystical state, or I guess just an altered state of consciousness in general. It's difficult to bring concrete information back from that kind of place a lot of the time, because you're in such an altered state of mind. You do need some kind of way in the moment to either note down or record any kind of insights that you might get. But then you sort of, I always find that you tread a very fine line with it, because if you lean into trying to record anything, you lose part of the experience, and the experience is kind of what makes it so transformative a lot of the time. So it is a fine line, but I'm kind of the same. I mean, I'm generally, even in my background, because my background was originally in, as I was saying in my email to you, I think my background's originally in archaeology.
That's right.
So I actually came into this originally from an academic perspective, more so than an actual witchcraft perspective. I had always been interested in spirituality, or I'd always been interested in, originally my core interest in magic, my sort of inroad into it was more ceremonial magic. It was more kind of the Western ceremonial tradition, more so than anything sort of traditional folkloric witchcraft. I was very kind of, as a part of my degree, I was studying a lot of the sort of medieval and early modern or Renaissance grimoires, so mostly like the Solomonic stuff. The Clavis Inferni, the Keys of Solomon, all those kinds of things. And that kind of got me on this inroad into this stuff that seems really cool. I wonder how we could put it into practice. And then things kind of just slotted into place that I found things like Crowley. I found other sort of high magic or ritual magic traditions. And then naturally, I kind of used a lot of my degree resources when I was out in mostly the Middle East, because I did a couple of years of excavation in Israel mostly. And, you know, when you go through, like you were saying earlier, there is a power in the land for it. And when you go through any of those kinds of places, especially places where there are still standing temples or standing places of worship, they do carry that kind of essence with them. And it is a very tangible thing that you can feel when you walk through that place. It's like a brick wall sometimes that hits you, like it's a powerful force that you feel. And a lot of my initial inroad was feeling these kinds of these sensations, whether it's what I would identify now as maybe entities or spirits or different currents of power, circuits of power, that kind of thing. I was feeling all of that, and I had no vocabulary for it. And then that was kind of what drew me into magic, where I was like, okay, what's going on here? How's everything working? And all that kind of stuff started happening. And then, like, as you say, right, it gets to the point where I think you start doing the rituals out of curiosity, but then you kind of realize that they actually work. Right. It's like, it's real. And then you're like, okay, there's something else going on here. Right. But it's interesting because it's you look at it, and a lot of the ceremonial and high magic procedures, anything derived from sort of Egyptian sources, it really is kind of a scientific approach a lot of the time, almost. Like, it is very logical speaking, and especially with the ceremonial side of things, you know, you have planetary hours, you have planetary days, the circles that you inscribe are all very meticulous and accurate. So it is a very logical system, which at the time worked for me, because I was like, in my mind, I was very, like, my sense of reason was just very elevated. So that's what was really good for me. But more and more as I've become, I guess I can say, experienced, nowhere near any kind of, like, I wouldn't ever profess to be a master in any of this. But as I've just learned more on my own journey, I have kind of steered more into traditional witchcraft, which is, it's been such an interesting experience to me, because yes, they're both, you know, ceremonial magic or high magic, and I guess what people would dub as low magic, right? It's the kind of the kitchen witchery, the folk witchcraft.
Yes.
But I kind of disagree with it in itself, right? I don't like those distinctions. But it's such an interesting difference, because it feels so much more of an intuitive, natural craft. It's something that there's not as much, I don't know, like meticulousness in it, right? It's not as logical focus. Like, you have to be open to an intuitive approach to it, because of the first and foremost, like you were saying earlier, traditional witchcraft is ultimately a natural craft, right? And it's very much a part of the land, and it's very much about getting down and dirty. It's getting your hands into the soil, in the most literal sense, right? Because you're getting your hands very much into the soil with the herbs. You're working with natural substances, and it's just been like such a paradigm shift for me going into that kind of work, because it's unlike any other practice that I've done, but it's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, you touched on several interesting points. I've done high ceremonial magic through Hermetics. I've done a lot of ancient Egyptian rituals, and they're really good. They're really powerful. And I really have come in contact through those rituals with some pretty amazing otherworld beings.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to say that is better or worse, good or bad. I don't like these terms high and low magic at all. I think those are almost egotistical labels that are put onto magic. And when you run across occultists that kind of snub practical magic or traditional witchcraft because it's low magic, I kind of cringe at all that, because for the traditional witch, magic is magic. And your spirituality actually comes through the magic. Even if it's something as practical as doing a prosperity spell, you're still working with these same forces, but you're working with them to bring about real tangible results. And I would be willing to bet that many of the people that go, well, I practice only high magic, I'm going to say something controversial, but I would be willing to bet that they're probably afraid to try to do practical magic, because they may not have the skill. They may not have the ability. Where the traditional witch just gets out there and says, I'm going to do it. If it doesn't work, it didn't work. When something happened, I'll fix it and I'll do it again. Yeah. It is also you mentioned too, you talk about the science behind it, how ceremonial magic, the ancient magic of the Middle East was more like a science, and I think that's really how traditional witchcraft looks at it too. It is a science, it is an art, it's a technology. There are certain fundamental principles behind the practice of this. And so if you look at magic in any culture, shamanic magic anywhere in the world, they still work on the same basic principles. They're just using different cultural symbols and forms, but the principles and practices are the same. And so in my mind, in fact, I start the third book out by talking about practical magic and the difference between high and low magic, and how I really do think that many people who make those distinctions either don't know enough about their practice or are afraid to try it in case they fail. And the traditional witch is very different. They're just saying, I'm just going to do it. They just go for it. And two, what I found is that when you get into ceremonial magic, a lot of times the ceremonial magician is working with very specific spirits. But in most of the rituals, it's more of a master-servant relationship. They're calling this being to the circle, commanding it to do certain things, using words of power, names of power, to make it do their will, and then sending it back. The traditional witch seeks to partner with or become familiar with the spirits, hence the term familiar spirit. The traditional witch seeks to form those relationships, whether it's a spirit that's in the house spirit, spirits of the land. It's not about commanding or controlling, it's about partnering with. And sometimes those don't work out. You work with a spirit and you find that this is not the one you want to work with. Like a relationship with a person, you end it and move on to the next one. Whoops, what'd I do?
I think you turned your camera. There you go. Wait, there you go.
So I think that's the real difference, is that the traditional witch tends to be very practical, but the concepts and principles are essentially the same. And so you find that a lot of, and when you look at cunning man books from the 1600s, they do incorporate certain images from various grimoires. But it's interesting too, if you look at some of the grimoires, there's certain folk magic incorporated into that. I think it's the Key of Solomon that has the shears and the sieve technique in the book. And I'm going, wait a minute, this is high magic, and they're using a folkloric, clearly European folkloric tradition from that time period. So there was a lot of crossover, and I think that's healthy, and it is really important to realize we shouldn't have this separation. What else can I tell you? Oh yeah, you also mentioned something I thought was interesting. How when you have been in these mystical states, the information's coming at you, and you need to write it down. When we moved up to the mountain in New Hampshire, I was still trying to practice a lot of the Hermetics, complete with the ritual robes and all of this out in the forest. Yet, I started having just a flood of information come to me, usually deep in sleep or late at night, and I'd wake up with all these images, and I'd have to run to my notebook and just scribble this stuff out, and later have to decipher it. And I want to say that a lot of what's in Horns of the Moon had its roots in those experiences. A lot of the information that I, quote, received from whatever was trying to communicate with me, I didn't put into writing because I still want to confirm it. I want to confirm that there's something to back it up. Otherwise, it's just personal gnosis, and you don't know for sure. But the material that's in Horns of the Moon, a lot of it came to me like that. But then I was able to go back and confirm it through documentation. I'm very big on that, because so many people will just say, "Well, I know because the spirits told me." Well, that's fine, but can you back it up with something real?
It's one of those things. I think it's interesting. So this is like a recurring theme that's been coming up in a lot of discussions I've been having recently. It's just that there's kind of that fine line, especially when you look at things like modern schools of magic that have come forth from like the 70s and 80s, like chaos magic, for example, right? Those kind of like very kind of postmodern, post-truth ideas where everything is kind of seen as like a group thought form or a group egregore, or it's all kind of seen as spirits are all in your mind and things like that. And it's such an interesting thing for me because there needs to be some kind of discussion around where the line is between what or how far you can go with sort of personal gnosis and how important that can be, because it absolutely is. And there is, I think, definitely space for personal gnosis and personal experiences with entities and things like that versus sort of traditional or historically accurate sources and things that you can things that are documented. And I think one of the biggest examples that I always very frequently see nowadays is the Egyptian god Thoth, right, or Dehuti in Egyptian. Mostly because when you look at a lot of what should we say, how do you identify, like New Age sources, right, or sort of like the New Age or New Thought movements, everything's sort of post Theosophy, sort of post Helena Blavatsky, that kind of idea. Thoth, out of all the other Egyptian gods, has kind of undergone this very extreme makeover in sort of mainstream culture, mostly sort of since the 1980s, 1990s, where he seems to have been very looped in with the whole sort of New Thought Atlantis kind of idea, which is it's very much removed from anything historical or any sort of historical representation of Thoth. And it creates a very difficult line because it's, you know, you have people going through mystical experiences saying that they're channeling Thoth, like will be the quote unquote Atlantean version of Thoth, right? Or they're channeling things from like more New Age sources, versus what you have in traditional conceptions and actual historical documentations and things of Thoth. And it's finding that line between like, okay, how much of the personal gnosis or what you may get from your own gnosis, your own rituals, or maybe like if you're on like a psychedelic or something like that and you're incorporating substances into ritual, versus documentation and documenting that and confirming it in historical sources. You know, it's an interesting fine line that we walk with it.
It is, and it's a real slippery slope. That's why all of my writing, I document everything. I have, I think each of the books I have close to 200 footnotes, and I cite, I think in both books, between 80 to 100 sources.
Yeah.
I really am a strong believer in documentation.
Yeah.
I want to know that when I'm talking about something in the books that I can back it up, that people know that I'd found some type of source other than my own personal experiences. Yeah. Now, when it is my experiences, I say, this is what I experienced. Take from it what you will. Yours may be different. But when it comes to Egyptian gods, there's a tremendous amount of well-documented information from historical records, academic texts, temple inscriptions. There's not a lot of room for mistakes. It's very clear with each of these beings. And I found that when I have and do work with the Egyptian gods, they've always come through very much in line with what has written from the ancient temples. Be honest, I stay clear of a lot of the more contemporary, if you want to call it that, New Age approaches. I really do. And much to a lot of people's chagrin, because some people come to me as students and, you know, they're masters at this type of crystal healing or whatever. And I go, you know, if it works for you, that's great, but it's not what we're doing. This is not what I teach. It's not how I was taught. Julie, she would sit there and make you read books. She would tell you what her family did. This is what we do, but you need to read this and come back to me and tell me what you thought of it. You know, and they're talking about an elderly woman living, you know, she had nothing to gain, but she was that serious about her art. Yeah. And I think that's the difference. If you look, I think if you read some of Deanna Fortune's books from the 30s, she lamented a lot about New Thought and the garbage. I think she called it the garbage or that was floating around at the time compared to the real magic that she was trying to teach. So I think this is just common, and it'll always be there in one form or another. I'm not trying to, if anybody's listening to this, I'm not trying to diss. We all have to start somewhere. Yeah. We all have to start somewhere. And if it means you pick up a book on the Atlantean Thoth and it piques your interest and causes you to dig deeper and to go further, then great. And then I'm not saying that that's an invalid source. It may be that there is something that these people are tapping into that's very real. I have no way of knowing. I really don't know. But they should not say that it supersedes anything that's already been proven or in the written records from the Egyptians themselves.
Right.
That's where I stand up and go, wait a minute, whoa, slow down here. And the same with witchcraft. I look at certain people today. The Wicca of today is very different from what Wicca was back in the 70s.
Yeah.
And it's much more almost whatever goes, whatever you want goes. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's not. I guess I'd like to see more training, more discipline, less just that this free for all of, hey, I'm a witch because, and I really but this is the way I was trained. I mean, back in the 70s, you had to be sponsored, you had to go through training, you had to go through a waiting period, then you were initiated, and then you went through further training. It was it's very different today.
It's one of those things. I think there's a large part of it, I think, is probably social media, right? Like the amount of Facebook and Instagram or whatever it is, like TikTok nowadays is like the big famous one. And there are like witch communities on there. And I don't know if you've ever seen TikTok or if you ever looked at sort of anything on TikTok as far as witches go.
I've only heard. I haven't looked at it.
Yeah, I wouldn't. It's not going to be serving you, Kerry.
Okay.
But it's such a fascinating space. And again, for everyone listening, I'm not dissing witch talk or anything like that. But you are absolutely right. Like the big thing that I see personally from my own practice, because again, like a lot of my practice, I was initiated into certain Hermetic orders, especially sort of orders derived from the Golden Dawn and those kind of things. So I have had a semblance of, I guess you could say, structured training via certain things. But a lot of my original practice, I met one of my mentors, I won't say his name, when I was very, very young. So I met my mentor when I was 10, 11, that sort of age.
Really? Nice.
And I initially for sort of 10 years when I was growing up, from being a child, he worked with me and he trained me mostly in more kind of it was kind of interesting because it wasn't so much it wasn't really ritual, or it wasn't what I would consider witchcraft, because he came at it more from like a basic kind of very free form energy perspective. Whereas like the ritual was kind of seen more as just like an external framework for how you're guiding the internal states, because all the magic is kind of internal, or a lot of the magic is internal. Yep. And a lot of the external elements of the ritual and things are, whether it's gestures or substances or correspondences in all the different things, they help guide the internal states. And I'm sort of from energy. So for the first sort of 10 years that I started training when I was a child, it was much more kind of energy focused. And I had, because we had a mentor-mentee relationship, it was much more structured, right? It was much more disciplined. And then I kind of went out of that into more sort of stable Hermetic orders. So it's kind of interesting, because when I look at it, I've gone through a long history, I guess you can say, of being trained in sort of more disciplined formats. So when I look at any of the sort of social media scenes for witchcraft, like the biggest thing that I see is a lack of discipline with it, or people sort of throwing they throw hexes or curses around left, right, and center like it means absolutely nothing, and people don't like see the gravity or the weight of the situation, what they're doing. But that's what that's what we're all hoping to change, I think, through whether it's through our own works, through our own platforms, whatever it is, right, where we're providing that structure, or we're trying to provide that structure to people. But it is, it's an interesting sort of generational divide. A lot of sort of teen witches are coming out now, but
in a way, I'm kind of excited by it, because there is such a tremendous interest. For a long time, I was afraid that I'm always afraid that the magical arts, that the traditions, the teachings are going to die out. I look at what Julie had, and I didn't want what she taught me to die away. I didn't want it to go away. I look at Sybil Leek, and though she was very commercial, she really was, but she put a lot of really excellent material out for the masses that was very good. And I look at that and I don't want that seed to fade away. There's a lot of wisdom in the magical arts. And so I look at this and I go, we're in an age now where this is really caught fire. A lot of people are back interested in it. So that's exciting to me. My hope is that in writing the books, I'm doing a number of classes, that maybe now is the time where some of the stuff that was kept hidden within families can come out, can be out there. And so I've put some stuff in these books that I know some of my teachers would be cringing at, because this was all stuff that was taught to me after initiation or after meeting, like in Julie's case, going through long interviews with her family before I was even accepted as a student. But I just think now's the time. I think we have to get it out there, especially now that there are so many people putting information out that may not be as in line with what was done in previous generations.
Yeah.
And so I want to sit there and say, well, here's what the past was. Here's the art as it's come through to me today from all these other sources that go back a long way. And I'm hoping that it will help people going forward. So that's why the books. And so in a way, I'm kind of excited by the TikToks. I'm excited by the interest. But at the same time, I kind of cringe because you'll read some of this stuff and you're on social media, and I just want to blast some of these people, say, wait a minute, you're totally off. And I have to say, let it go, let them do the thing, and instead just put out what I know. And again, I'm not saying that what I have been taught is the one right true witchcraft. It's not. It's a very experiential system.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think all witchcraft is.
It is.
I think it's one of those things. I mean, it's always one of those awkward situations where you will always. I think in general we will always attract people who are sort of spiritually minded. In general, they are the kinds of people who will naturally be drawn to witchcraft. Right. The vast majority of the public who are not interested in spirituality, who are not in this current of thought, aren't going to be attracted to witchcraft. But then even then, we have to, as practitioners, as magicians, as witches, whatever it is we want to call ourselves, we also have to battle that sort of ensuing tide of people saying that a witchcraft and the occult is evil and it's a form of perverse spirituality and that kind of thing, right? Or that occult magic is dark magic and that kind of thing. And that's itself is always a challenge, right? Because we are facing a huge amount of people, even from mainstream spiritual communities now. Or even the church, even like mainstream churches and that kind of thing. The witches have been battling the church for like the past 1,000 years, right? They've been in position for the past 1,000 years. So again, it's nothing new, right? But I think, the best thing that we can do in these kind of situations is to just put the work out there, and then the work will itself attract, I think, the people that need to read it. A lot of the time, that's the experience of it I've found. People will always kind of lean into. I don't know, because it's an interesting thing. The thing that always got with me was, because it's funny, even when I was coming at it from an academic perspective originally, because I started, I can be very thankful for my mentor because I started so young. So my mindset was kind of conditioned in a certain way to believe in witchcraft when I was younger. But I remember at the start still being afraid of witchcraft, or being afraid of the idea of witchcraft when I was going into it, because there was a lot of programming of what the word meant, or what occultism meant, or what occult, or what magic meant, or anything like that. I remember going into it and I was afraid. And it's interesting to just sort of chart the progression. Because I remember, like I can give you an example from last week actually. So I was around my half, ironically, actually the other week, and I was doing a ritual for myself. And what people always have interesting discussions, and there are tons of different ways that people talk about how entities appear to them, or how they show signs of their presence or indicators of their presence, that kind of thing. And I remember one of the things that was happening to me, or what happened to me last week, is I had some candles and stuff set up around a hearth, and also I was sort of I was doing a meditation, I was saying some incantations, all that kind of thing. And my door, basically to my my living room where my hearth is, basically slammed shut when I was just doing my incantations. And it's funny to me because a part of me now feels almost more comfortable during ritual than it does in like general life at this point, where it's like, because I'm so used to rituals.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm used to that kind of energy that the ritual room creates, or that kind of, I guess what we would say is raising the energy, or in Haunted Moon, we call it stirring the cauldron, right? That kind of change, well, I mean, there's a distinction between those, right? Of course, but that kind of change in the atmosphere that comes during ritual, that feeling has kind of become comfortable to me now. So that's quite a nice sensation for me when I'm in ritual. But I still can't deny that even now, after 10 so years of practice, I still get scared when the door slams, right? I still get scared when stuff happens, and I'm like, it's scary. It's terrifying to me. But
that's funny. I mean, I'm the opposite. Oh God, I put it in the third book. I talk about hauntings and necromancy.
Yeah.
But I lived in a house in North Carolina with what happened was the Coven in California disbanded after it was with Julie. Something happened, Coven disbanded, and the priestess, mistress, she decided to move to North Carolina, and I decided to follow. And there we rented a house, and we reconstituted the Coven and started attracting people. But that's a whole nother story. But the house itself was interesting. The house was an older house, I was going to say from the 1800s, which isn't old compared to England, but for us in the
new world, yeah.
Right. But that house had a number of interesting phenomena that happened over the course of time. And there were times, I talk about it in the book. I remember one night I was getting ready for work because I worked very early at a shipyard on the coast. Had to be up like 3 a.m. because it got so hot. We had to work before it got hot. And I was up getting my breakfast. It was about 3-4 in the morning, still dark. And she had her room on the first floor, and I was on the second floor, and that's where the kitchen was. And I heard a set of foots come up the stairs and down the hall. And I said, it's going to be a nice day today. And heard the bathroom door shut. Nothing. I go out there. Lights on. I had opened that door and turned the light off when I'd use it. I thought, well, that's odd. She has a bathroom downstairs. Go knocking on the door, open it, and nobody's in there. Another time we were sitting in the on the second floor, and the third floor was interesting in this house. We never found the history of the house. Third floor was a finished attic, and one of the rooms was painted black with dark blue walls. The floor was black. And we thought, well, that's odd, but we started using that as our ritual room.
Sure.
But, and there was no furniture up there on the third floor anywhere. So one night, it's about 8-9 o'clock, we're sitting at a table on the second floor, eating something, talking about Coven business and what's going on. And we could hear tremendous loud scraping and banging, like furniture being dragged. I raced up those stairs as fast as I could. I was going to catch whatever it was. Nothing. There was nothing there. Yet another time, a bunch of us were on the third floor. We were cleaning the place up. It was a bright, sunny day. One of the doors of the closet just slowly opened and stopped. We got up, went over, tried to move it. It wasn't like it. Yeah, I love that stuff. It's like, I go right for it. Okay, what happened? Why did that happen? It doesn't scare me, but it fascinates me. I'm always trying to dig deep and say, okay, well, what was it? We would have lights come on and off, candles all of a sudden light up. It was to me, that's fun. I'm not afraid of that. I enjoy that stuff.
I think it's a good way to be. I think, like, if we can, I suppose that I suppose this is like a good thing for anyone who is starting out in witchcraft or starting out in the craft. I think when people like the fear around entities or around spiritual creatures in general is probably, I think, one of the biggest roadblocks for beginner witches, I think, or people who are starting out, because especially when, again, all of the kind of connotations that the word the occult or witchcraft brings with it, and also, horror movies and mainstream movies and that kind of thing, people are conditioned to it. So one of the things that a lot of the time stops people progressing, or even stops people really doing the rituals in the first place, is a fear around the entities that they're either going to get hurt somehow, or in the worst case scenarios, they're going to get possessed by some like spooky demon or whatever, which is kind of hilarious to me. But again, we have to be compassionate where people are, I guess. But what sort of is your take on this whole thing? Like, do you think like it's evident that, you know, in I guess like the darker sides of witchcraft, when there are curses and things involved, that absolutely there are entities that can do that kind of thing. But
we live the reality is that, at least for the witch, for the magician, is that our world is very thin. The material world is as vast as it seems, of this galaxies. It's really very thin and sits between two very large dimensions of realities. I talk about them in Horns of the Moon. No, in Willowpath, and I think Horns of the Moon too. The Anun and the Abred. But the reality is that our world is on a threshold between these other dimensions. There are energies and spirits and otherworld beings that come through quite often, and we too, through the techniques I talk about in the books, can go and visit those realms ourselves by changing our state of consciousness. And so if somebody is new to witchcraft but they're afraid of encountering these beings, it's not the path for them, because the whole point of traditional witchcraft, and I would say of medieval magic, is working with and becoming familiar with these entities, these beings. You've got to approach them more like you would when you meet somebody new. Here, I'm just meeting you.
Yeah.
What kind of person is this? Do I want to form a friendship and relationship with this person? Or do I want to say, this one's a little weird, I'm going to stay away? You know, it really is the same. There's not a lot of difference. The idea that this spirit somehow has some power over you, it depends on the spirit, and it depends on your ability, and it depends how much power you give it. And that's you know, you do have to take certain safeguards. Keep yourself healthy. Make sure you know how to have energy flow through yourself, can control energy. Have the training so you know what kind of words or symbols can repel things or attract things. But ultimately, a lot of it comes down to you have the ability to say no. You do have the ability to say, I don't want this. And I strongly recommend to anybody that if you encounter or are working with a deity that begins to demand blind faith, absolute devotion to it and nothing else, it's the only being available, that you know, you need to step back and say, wait a minute, this is not going to work. This is not right. Just like you would not allow a person to do that in your life. And I think that's where people make the mistake. You know, they think when they conjure up something with the Ouija board that they're going to get possessed. It's only if you allow it to. You can always stop the communication. You can just say, no, I'm not doing this. Yeah, I'm not doing it. It really is that simple. And there are techniques, if you feel that the house is haunted, if you feel that something's happening, there are techniques you can use to control those entities or to banish them altogether. And in the situation we were at in North Carolina, we did just that. But frankly, we didn't feel threatened. We ended up using some magic because we were also the subject of, there was another group that was jealous of us, and they were doing some things against us, and we used some techniques against them to stop that. But it really is about taking responsibility for your own spiritual life, your own magical life, and not giving that over to some other person or entity. And I think that's, so if you're new to this and you're just coming in and you're going, I really want to learn it, but I'm afraid of ghosts, I'm afraid of spirits, this may not be the path for you. It really isn't. You may want to go toward more orthodox philosophy where somebody else is taking that kind of care of you for you. But the path of the witch is a lonely one, or the magician. We take responsibility and experience these energies for ourselves. And I'd say the more seasoned witches and probably magicians relish. We can't wait to have those experiences because it tells us, one, it's working, it's real. And then, well, what is this force? And is this force something I can partner with and work with? Or is it something I want to banish and move on to something else? That's my take on it. So I don't know if that's what newbies would want to hear because
well, no, I think it might not be what they want to hear. I think it's probably what they need to hear more than anything. And it's it's one of those. It's one of those. It's always one of those awkward conversations. I think whenever I sort of have to have this conversation with people, it turns a bit funny. But I think inherently, from an experiential point of view, I don't think there's ever anything to be afraid of. Personally speaking, I very like in terms of entities that I have encountered or I have worked with in my own practice, I can count, on one hand the number of times that I felt threatened or I felt sort of afraid of something in my practice, and that's been going on for a decade or so now. So it is quite rare for me to feel threatened by any kind of presence nowadays. But it is kind of interesting because you touched on something there a second ago that was quite interesting. One of the reasons that you have to do magic in that place was because another group was working against you. Yeah. So I wonder if part of the I don't know what you call it, part of the threat narrative actually sometimes comes more from other witches or other magicians than it does than other entities.
Yeah. I would say that is human nature is what it is. There are people that are, as soon as you step onto this path, there are going to be people to take notice. And there's some, I encounter all the time, some that feel that, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about, and I'm going to show him. Or there's some that just get jealous. It's just human nature. And I, after, like, say, 50 plus years of doing this, I've come to the conclusion that you have to set up your protections. You have to. And that's one of the first things I teach new people. And you have to reset those protections usually every 6 months, both around your home and around yourself. I'm firmly convinced of that. When I have let them lapse over time, then things start to happen, and in a good way. And I could cite story after story of instances where people have tried to do things to me. Some were fairly successful, and I had to then go in and do the counter magic. But it's unfortunate. It really is. And it's something which I do not. It's extremely rare that I will curse somebody. Extremely rare. I can probably count maybe on less than half my hand how many times I've actually done that. But I've had multiple times when I know people have done it to me, and I've had to reverse it back onto them. And the techniques that we use really are designed not just to protect, but to send it back. And that's, if they're not doing anything, nothing's going to happen to them. But if they are, they're going to get it. And we've seen some pretty dramatic results happen after we did our reversals. Pretty dramatic.
I suppose this brings up a slightly interesting conversation around the morality of I guess what we would say, whether it's cursing or even just like counter cursing in general, just like the idea of morality as a whole in magic, like to what extent is doing magical rituals, especially when another person is involved. To what extent is there? What are the ethics or just justifiability around that? Do you think? What are your experiences, at least?
In the Willow Path, the first book, I talk about the ethics that Julie and Sybil both taught, and Julie was really adamant that there is a code of conduct that you have to follow. That in her mind, this is back in the 70s, the witch is held to a higher standard than the average magician or pagan. But again, this is from her family traditions.
Sure.
And as far as cursing, it's only in self-defense. It's when you have done everything else you can, so now it's time just to give it all you got. And I've done that very rarely. Usually, it's more about protection. It's about setting up your protections. A fun thing, one that I really enjoy doing because it has no negative effects on you, and it will have no negative effects on the person who you think is doing the spell against you, unless they actually are. It's something that I mentioned. I show a picture of it in the Willow Path, and I talk about it in the new book that's coming out soon. It's a mirror box. And this was taught to me by some Welsh traditionalists. When we moved to North Carolina, we came in contact with they claimed to be Welsh traditionalists, but they would use this technique where they would take mirror tiles and have the mirrors all facing in, cover it in black, open it up, put the tag lock, the item that relates to the person, into the mirror box and close it. and then do a simple spell that would basically all the energy went into the box and reflect back onto them. And I've had that be extremely effective in several cases. That's one that's you're not harming, you're not doing anything that could come back on you. Because it's only going to affect them if they're doing something to you. And it's a nice little basic practical magic thing that we do. There's several others, but that's one. Yeah,
it reminds me actually. There's a ritual. I can't even remember nowadays. Like it's one. I think it's along the similar lines. I guess it's another kind of mirror box ritual that was taught to me when I quite a few years ago. Again, I can't remember who actually taught it to me, but it follows sort of the same idea where you sort of get a basic box, you get sort of mirrors, put them on all the sides. And then there are some other little slight adjustments, which are always funny to me because it's the same kind of general practice, same general method. It's just there's little nuances that each family adds or each different thing adds. And for me, it was interesting because we would get the box, we'd get like mirrors on either side. Then you get another like little one, and then you would smash it. So you have all the shards of the mirror, and then you would have the tag lock in the box with the mirror shards. And then we would create or consecrate what I guess we would call like black salt, which is basically just like if you get like a charcoal disc that's been burnt down from like an incense offering or whatever, mix it with some consecrated salt or whatever, or salt that you've sort of done a blessing over or done a spell over or something like that. Mix them together so the salt turns black, because then in theory, if you think of the correspondences and stuff, the correspondences of the salt get mixed over with the charcoal, which then has like an absorbing effect, basically. Put it in the box with the tag locks, everything like that, seal it up, and then either go and ritually bury it or maybe throw it into a stream or a river or something like that, right, to carry it away. Well, it's effectively the same idea. So basically if the person is in fact doing some work against you, all of the energy, because by the salt and the charcoal and everything, it'll be absorbed. All of that energy will be absorbed into the box, and then it will get absorbed either into the tag lock or then just reflected in the mirrors and then back around. So all the energy will just get sent back to them. Nice. But it's such an interesting idea because it's the same, more or less the same sort of ritual, but it's just those little nuances that come in, which are so fascinating to me. All the little differences that you have. It's
we do more. That was the basic technique, but I like it. I like the idea of adding the black salt. What I do too sometimes, especially if it's somebody I'm really upset with, I'll put the tag lock in. I'll do this at dark moon, and I usually have a separate mirror that I hold in my hand, and my black hilt knife, the ophthalmi, if you want to call it that, but the black hilt knife, and then I will have a black candle as well. And the black candle absorbs energy, brings it to the box. And then I have another mirror on the outside. I've already sealed everything up in the black box, but then I will use a very specific chant to really drive home the point that that's going to go to them. And usually I will enhance this by calling on certain spirits to help me. You'll find that in traditional witchcraft, we do a lot with spirits, a lot with other world entities. That's why I say if you're nervous about working with spirits or coming in contact with spirits, it's not the path for you, because so much of traditional witchcraft is that. Yeah. Now, I will say in Wicca, I have not encountered that much. There they have a goddess and a god. But I have not, as I recall, in the years that I was with it, we didn't do, and I didn't come across many groups that worked a lot with spirits. No. But Julie did, Traditional Witchcraft does, Ceremonial Magic does to a certain extent. And I find the more I work with this technique, the more I find that you do want to work with these other world entities. Sure. And that's when the magic really takes off, becomes much more effective, in my opinion. Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's an interesting point, actually, Ray. So again, when you look at because it's a difficult thing, because even nowadays with modern Wicca, there are so many different branches of it. So it's difficult to sort of pin down a particular one. But if you look at sort of very traditional Wicca, or sort of what we would dub as, I guess, Gardnerian Wicca, right? So everything derived from Gardner. It's kind of funny to me that there's a little bit of an inconsistency with it, because a lot of Gardner's original writings
obviously claim to be from sort of British or European folklore. But when you look at the majority of the rituals practiced in Wicca, they seem to take a lot more from the ceremonial tradition, or they're inspired a lot more from the ceremonial tradition than sort of what we call traditional witchcraft.
A lot of his rituals are almost word for word from Crowley. I mean, he knew Crowley. He had wasn't he an honorary member of the OTO?
I think so. Yeah, he was part of a lot of. I know he was part of a lot of the Rosicrucian orders, or a lot of sort of Hermetic derived orders.
When you look at the Great Rite of a Gardnerian witchcraft tradition, and it is almost word for word some of Crowley's, and there's nothing wrong with that. Crowley was good. I mean, he was really good. The guy was a genius, in my opinion. Some people really are afraid of him.
Yeah, I was on a podcast the other day talking about Crowley. It's one of those things. We have, I don't know if you guys have it over there, but we have like a toast or bread spread called Marmite. It's kind of like the Australian Vegemite. It's like a yeast extract. It's like really, really irony, and it has like a really strong taste. And its tagline, and they've always marketed them. So it's been around for a crazy amount of years, even when like my grandparents were kids. And then their whole tagline is that you have to have a really strong stomach to take it. And they're really sort of out there with it. And they're just like, okay, you either love it or you hate it. And there's no in between. And like when they're even trying to market it to people who don't like it, like you either love it or you hate it. That's it. And I think that's kind of the same approach a lot of people have of Crowley, at least when you look at them you look at him from the outside perspective. Where you either get groups of people who think he's really, really great and he's a genius, or you get people who are very, very averse to him. And really don't like him. It's kind of interesting, but there's not that much middle ground. But
in my opinion, I think the guy was a genius, but he was also perverted.
Yeah, I think
he had some very odd tastes in his life. But and I can't relate to that. But he had, when you look at his basic teachings in magic and theory and practice and some of the others, the man knew his stuff. He was really good. But you have to know your stuff to understand him, or you're not going to get it, and it's going to be way over your head. It took me years and years. When I first got into this, I was trying to read this, what is this stuff? Now I read it and I go, it's so simple what he was saying. You've got to have the experience, or you're not going to get it, and it's not for beginners. It's not.
Yeah, it's a weird situation. I think, magic in theory and practice could, I don't know if I would describe it as a beginner, but I'd say maybe intermediate. But like, I don't know if I would start witches off with Crowley. I don't know if he's like an introductory figure.
No. That would scare him off. That would. Yeah. But when you're returning to Gardner, there's so much controversy surrounding this, but I see absolutely no reason why he could not have come across some folks that knew cunning magic, some folklore, that had practices that were going back. I think he was telling the truth to a certain extent. I think he found pieces and parts, and like he said, he decided to put it together using other sources, and he created Wicca. These academics that say he made it all up, I don't believe that. I believe he did exactly what he said. He found these pieces and filled in the gaps with what he thought it was, and created this religion that is Wicca. And so I find parts of Wicca that are just really wonderful. At least the Wicca that I was trained in, there are parts of it that really are wonderful. It's a good natural approach to living. It's a good basic spiritual path. I really enjoyed it. It's just, I've moved on to something. I wanted to go deeper into the traditions and the practices, and how do I experience these things? So that's why so much of Horns of the Moon was teaching people how to step beyond the body and get into nature and experience these other world beings that are there, that are real. In my mind, they're real. The being I spoke of in there, the lady in red. I mean, she, in my opinion, this was a real entity. She is real. As real as you are. I have as much proof that you exist as I do her. I mean, I'm seeing you now, but I don't know. You're telling me something across the ocean. You're right. Seriously? She's telling me she's from this realm, this other dimension, this other place, but it penetrates ours.
Yeah.
to me, she's just as real. And then, so the thing I like about traditional witchcraft is it is practical. It is real. It does work. And you can do these techniques and experience it for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. This isn't faith-based. It's not dogma. There's no book that says this is it. It's here's the techniques. Do it yourself and see what you get. And you're probably going to get similar results. And that's what I like about being a witch is you take responsibility for your own path. As opposed to relying on a priesthood or something else. In traditional witchcraft, there's very few that have a degree system. There's usually one initiation, and some will have degrees, but the vast majority it's one initiation, and that's when you finally get to that point that you're there, you've gotten that much knowledge, now you're part of the group, and then that's it. So you really are almost working alone, even though you're with other people at times. I know Sybil talked about that in some of her books, which really, because she talked a lot about Wicca, but she talked to the fact that her and her coven would meet very rarely, usually at the cross-quarter dates, but the vast majority of the time they worked alone. And that's very traditional in the older witchcraft, not in contemporary. So
I think it's one of those things. I've heard a couple of traditional witchcraft authors talk about this, but it's an interesting idea that when you look at traditional witchcraft as a whole, it doesn't really have, or like as a system, by its nature, it doesn't have a single founder. It doesn't have a system of hierarchy because it's the magic of the people. It's the magic of the folk. Like it doesn't have. So like if you look at something like Hermeticism, right, it can always be traced back to Hermes Trismegistus or all those sort of divinized wisdom figures. But traditional witchcraft doesn't have what would you like a strong lineage back to a single founding father or founding mother or founding figure or whatever it is, right? Because by its nature, it is just the culmination of traditional law. It's the culmination of family law. It's an ever evolving practice, and I think this is one of the challenges I personally have with like traditional Wicca, almost, because one of the big things that Gardner, who we were just talking about it, right? But I absolutely do think when I really sit and think about it, I think it does seem fairly likely that Gardner probably did meet like what's he called, the New Forest Coven. I think that's what they call it, right? I think it's fairly likely that there was, and I mean there has been a decent amount of evidence that has come out. There were people who did identify as witches who were living in sort of the Hampshire area, that were practicing. To what extent they are related to sort of traditional cunning circles or anything like that, or anything like that, is still up for dispute. But people did exist, and it seems fairly accurate that Gardner did meet with somebody, at least in some capacity. Part of the issue, and this is like more so, it's kind of interesting how it shifted, because this has kind of disappeared in a lot of the modern Wiccan circles. But in the traditional Gardnerian circles, Gardner was very good friends with Margaret Murray, so the British academic who sort of affectionately called the grandmother of Wicca. And she had the whole idea with the witch cult hypothesis, that the witch trials in early modern England or whatever were an attempt by Christianity to wipe out sort of a pan-European witch cult, where there was like all witches always worked in a coven of 13. They were high priestesses, and they were practicing some kind of old religion that was survived the coming of Christianity, and it was all that kind of thing. I don't like to me, when I look at a situation like that, and again, you can look at it from the academic perspective, and the academic perspective is that it's entirely been disproven, because Murray was not very meticulous with her treatment of the trial records and things like that. But I think even the topic itself is kind of contrary to the idea of traditional witchcraft, because traditional witchcraft, by its nature, because it is the magic of the people, it's continually added to. It's not a singular religion as sorts. Yes. It's a set of practices, or a worldview that you're interacting with the natural land around you, the natural cycles, that kind of thing. So it kind of defeats the object if you see it as a full-on religion or organized religion, I think. But I mean, it's an interesting debate, it's an interesting question, because would you, in your experience, because I've seen a couple of different witches or authors sort of talk about this, would you consider traditional witchcraft as a religion in and of itself, or more just like a set of practices?
it depends on what you call religion. Now, if you read my books, sometimes when I actually use the term "the old religion," I think it's because of my training. Julie, Sybil, they both use that term. But what is religion? And I will say, when it comes to Murray, I'm really afraid that academics are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's a tremendous amount, if you look at it objectively, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that there was goddess worship, pagan worship of different entities that existed and continued to exist on for quite a long period of time. And I talk about that in the Willow Path. I devote a chapter to it. But there's that it did continue, but I think it became so broken and diluted over time because of the influx of the Mediterranean Abrahamic systems, the persecutions, that it eventually just was so diluted that it got to the point where people were just doing things because it was their culture. And didn't know the meanings behind it. And then I think at the same time, you had Hermeticism coming in through some of the larger cities. You had magicians. You had a lot of universities teaching magic. You look at Prague or Toledo, Spain. You had this Hermetics coming in, and this magic, the worldview at the time was one very spiritualist, where people did see spirits everywhere. And that I think a lot of the older practices and cultures, folkloric customs that were inherited from pagan traditions blended with the Renaissance magic, the Hermetics, and I think that's where traditional witchcraft comes from. When you say, is it a religion? There's a spiritual aspect to this. There's no doubt. I talk about it at the end of Horns of the Moon. And for me, that's some of the most fulfilling parts of it, where I look to directly communicate with and experience these otherworld beings in a very real way. And so is that religion or is it mysticism? Is it spirituality or is it dogma? Where's the line of religion? What do you call it? Now, if you're calling religion this thing where it started on this date with this prophet because of this book, and this cult built a center and spread out, no, it's not religion. But if it's a set of practices and techniques that enable you to experience otherworld beings and to find a deeper, richer meaning and reality to life, then yeah, it is. And so that's why I'm hesitant to use that term. That's why I prefer to call it the art. It's the art. And I think we as human beings aren't going to fully realize who we are until each takes responsibility for their own destiny, their own spiritual path, and that you don't have to identify with a religion. You don't have to identify with a label. So that's why I've kind of moved away from the whole Wicca thing, and all of that. And that's why when people say, "What religion are you?" It's complex. I'm at this. I'm at the point. It always kind of makes people laugh because people always in my line of work, as running a witchcraft community in general, or running a sort of platform like this, I get asked a lot. I'm like, okay, well, what are you? Well, people ask me like, hey, what are you? Are you Wiccan? Do you identify as pagan? Are you like Hermeticist, whatever? And I love to kind of just throw them off guard. Like, I'm Chris. That's it. That's all that matters to me. That's the only label that I identify myself with. That's the only one that matters to me. The reality is we're pretty basic. We're little bugs running around on this tiny rock in the middle of this giant universe that probably is part of multiple universes. What we are seeing is just a very tiny glimpse of reality. So to say that this is it, that this religion is it, or whatever, we don't know. I don't think we're at a point where any single person, no matter how spiritually evolved they are, really can fully comprehend what it's all about. And I do believe, though, in things like reincarnation and karma. There's a tremendous amount of evidence for reincarnation. I've gone through a number of past life regressions. I believe there's some type of purpose behind it all, and that you evolve and grow. I think a large part of the whole magical path is reaching beyond this state to move on to a more complex state. One of the things in one of our rituals is where the witch queen says, how's it go? Come, take my hand, rise as a falcon that you may be as the gods. And the whole idea is, and this was taken from some Egyptian texts that I found in Dendera, but the whole idea is that you become self-actualized and you are more and can be more, that you can be as these more complex beings. You're not a sheep in a flock with a shepherd watching over you. You are responsible for you. And that these beings are there and they're willing to help you, to make contact with you and work with you. Some of them are. Some of them couldn't care less about us. They really couldn't. but there are certain other world beings that have taken an active interest in human development and are there and want to help for whatever reason. I honestly don't know why. Such as this goddess Hathor. I firmly believe that. But
well, I mean, Hathor is she's always been. I think even in certain Egyptian circles, if my memory serves, she was often seen as the mother of the king a lot of the time, or even maybe Isis as well. Sometimes as well is seen as the mother. But Hathor is a very interesting entity because she does have that kind of very, I guess, nurturing aspect of the divine feminine. As a goddess, but I mean, again, you talk about this in Horns. I was rereading this section the other day. Actually, you talk about this in Horns of the Moon, the idea of names, and how much of an issue or how much of a powerful thing names can be, because we use the term Hathor, but as you said in Horns of the Moon, right? The name Hathor is just the Greek transliteration of the Egyptian Huter, was it Huteru? Or Hutor, which is just House of Horus, which isn't actually her name. It's a title. So a lot of the names for deities that we have are actually not their actual names. They're just titles that were ascribed to them a lot of the time. And then obviously the power of this is something that I've spoken about at length. Actually, it's a theme that keeps coming back up. But the power of the name, or I should say, the secret name or the sacred name in magic, right? And I guess this is another discussion that we can have. I mean, how are you doing for time? Actually, I suppose you should say.
Oh, I'm good. We can keep. We can keep going.
We can go. I guess I would be mindful because we've been like an hour and a half. I'm good. I can go. I can go for ages. You can shut me up whenever. So.
No, we're doing good. On the thing with names. It's interesting in traditional witchcraft. I don't know how much names are used in traditional witchcraft.
I've noticed.
I have such a strong emphasis on hermetics that we have secret names that we use, and I have multiple names, and they represent different or more complex or spiritual aspects of myself, and I only use them at certain times. But in traditional witchcraft, I am so back to our original discussion about the history of witches. I mean, there is enough evidence to show, even from the 1800s, some texts that talk about various people meeting on the downs. This is in the Cornish Book of Folklore by Botwell, a couple different books he wrote, but he was collecting lore from the 1800s. And he talks about how initiates, and he called them initiates, would meet in lonely places on the downs and at certain times to practice their art.
Yeah.
If it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. That was the 1800s. Sybil was born in 1917, Julie in the 1920s. Gardner met his group in the 30s. And there wasn't that much of a gap. These people were around. Now, if you go back to the persecution times, I firmly do believe that there were. I mean, rural communities, humans are we're social creatures. If you're practicing magic and you find somebody else is practicing magic, let's compare notes. There probably were groups that did meet. And probably in secret, and had to because their lives depended on it. But now the question names come up. Would you use your real name? Would you take a different name? How would you conceal your identity? Would you need to? It's a small community. But if that group, I'm thinking it's very possible that some of these people would have just used a nickname or a magical name or a secret name and not wanted to use their Christian name out of fear of being identified. And so I think that's part of where the names come from in witchcraft. When it comes to the use of names, when it comes to entities, beings, I think knowing the name of the being is very important, because that name identifies them. It helps. It helps you understand their essence, their character.
Yeah.
And so I think in Hawthorne's case, or Hutru, you'll find that there's a number of other names that were used in the temples, but they were more secret. And some Egyptologists have went so far as to say that different temples had secret names for the same deity, but they would use them on their own.
Yeah.
Now, for us, I use, and I put it in, I don't think I flat out say it's a secret name, but I do put in the name that we use for when we call on Hathor, and it's drawn from Egyptian texts. Usos, the goddess of creation. She was mated to Ra. But there are different names that you can research if you dig deep. But names are very powerful. They really are. And so in our little group, we do, the initiates do have your, of course, your regular name, but then you'll have a name at initiation, and then you also take a secret name for yourself. And, but that's what we do. And I'm not saying that's, I know for a fact there's certain traditional groups that do not do this. That do not.
I've seen it's interesting. I know in a lot of sort of Golden Dawn derived groups, when you get past sort of the portal grades, you usually take on like an inner or an inner order name. Usually that was kind of standard for me when I was growing up with that kind of system. But yeah, it's interesting because like I feel the secret name as a concept, it is very, I feel like it's a very Egyptian concept. And it factors very prominently into Egyptian sources. We have, especially, and again, this is one of the biggest reasons that I absolutely love the Greek magical papyri. I don't know if you've seen the Greek magical papyri.
I am aware of it. I have not worked with it. Any of my Egyptian stuff is more from Pharaonic Egypt.
Right.
I'm getting more and more curious about it, though. It got so muddled up with all the different techniques that were going on in the Mediterranean at the time.
Yeah.
But I think it's a critical step, because I'm firmly convinced, I know, based on the archaeological evidence, that when Egypt started falling, the temples of Dendera, Edfu, Philae, Isis's temple, when those were being closed down in the around 400 AD or CE.
I think Philae was shut in the late 500s, I think.
500s, yeah.
Like,
you know, I know from for example, Dr. Robert, Alison Roberts. She talked a lot about this, that the priesthood began going out and teaching in small groups and secret groups. So you have this transmission from Pharaonic Egypt into later periods of time, and it had to have gotten caught into Pythagorean teachings, Kabbalistic teachings. All of this stuff got mixed together, and I think eventually that's what formed Hermetics. I really believe. And then Hermetics, of course, moved on over the centuries into Europe, into the centers of learning, and eventually merged with folkloric pagan practices, cultural practices of the common folk. And here's traditional witchcraft. I really think that's the history.
Yeah.
I really do. But it's really interesting. So I want to learn more about the Greek papyri. And there's a number of excellent sources out now, but it's because I think it's a key step to understanding how it moved from Egypt into Hermetics. I think
it's one of those things. Because Hermetic, or the Hermetic, I mean, so the Hermetica in general it's absolutely fascinating to me. And a lot of my study was a lot of my early study actually was on the Hermetica. I was very sort of fascinated by that when I first started out. And it's a really interesting idea, because we have what I guess we would dub as sort of the classical Hermetica, or the ancient Hermetica, and then kind of what I guess we can say is like neo-Hermetica, which is when all of sort of the Hermetic ideas and philosophies crossed over into sort of the 19th, 20th centuries, and then got exposed to kind of theosophy and like the new thought movements and that kind of thing. But when we look at sort of original, I guess what we could say Egyptian Hermetica, it's really divided into, at least in modern study, it's really divided into two sections. We have sort of the philosophical Hermetica and the technical Hermetica.
Okay.
And the philosophical ones are much better preserved, and they are in general just they're interesting philosophies, right? It's more Hermetic thought, the idea of correspondences, of the divine mind, of that kind of idea, all those kinds of things. The technical Hermetica are more of the kind of practical stuff. Really, it's like texts on alchemy, on different kinds of magic, that kind of thing. But the problem we have with it is a lot of those texts are only preserved in Arabic. They're not translated into English. And the problem that we have with it, and again, I was talking about this the other day, it's one of the major problems that we have in academia in general. There's not really a concerted effort to translate them because the majority of the topic is magic and astrology and alchemy and that kind of thing, in comparison to something like philosophy, which, you know, philosophy still has a very accepted place in universities, right? You can get a degree in philosophy, but you can't get a degree in magic, right? Magic, esotericism, it's not as accepted. So there's just not as much incentive for academics to come in and translate them because they're just they're seen as like pagan witchcraft, and they throw the baby out. You know? And it's kind of upsetting.
Exactly.
How it all works. But it's then you sort of look at all of the modern Hermetics, and this is more stuff like what we see with like the Kybalion and those kinds of things, where it's like the Kybalion is a really interesting text. And don't get me wrong, there is maybe influences from Hermetic ideas, but it's really kind of a new Hermetic text.
It is.
It's like
no
a
doubt.
new thought
No
Hermetic text. It's not really anything remotely like ancient Hermetic.
I don't see anything in it that would be ancient, but there's some influence there. It's clearly a Victorian era esoteric work, but it's interesting.
Like a little bit of
good stuff in there. I can see why Julie liked it, and there's parts of it that are just not. You were just right, but there are parts where you go, I can relate to this. This fits. It makes sense.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
I think it's like I think the thing that continually attracts people to it is it does explain things very well. I think it is a very good sort of introductory text to the idea of sort of, I guess, a more kind of spiritual philosophy in general. And I think that's part of the reason it's so common, or it's so attractive to people, because it does explain things very simply. And it's kind of interesting because, like, when you start on that Hermetic bandwagon and you sort of start going with it, that's kind of what originally led me back to the Greek magical papyri. Because again, because they are kind of all Egyptian influenced. And then I eventually got to the PGM, I guess, the Papyri Magica in Latin. And it's absolutely fascinating to me. And honestly, right now, like the two predominant streams of my practice right now are traditional witchcraft and then the Greek magical papyri. Like, that's it. I kind of rarely do ceremonial magic anymore, which is ironic because that's what I was raised on. But I'm mostly doing traditional craft and then the Greek magical papyri. And the reason I love them so much, or the Greek magical papyri so much, is they focus very heavily on, or the idea of secret or sacred names are pretty much at the core of magical practice in the Greek magical papyri. A lot of the incantations, a lot of the hymns, the rituals, all of that kind of thing, they are partly incantation, but the other, like, a major part of it is it just lists all of the secret names that, like you said, would have been used in different priesthoods and different temples, that kind of thing. And we find when you look at it, it's a bit of an annoying catch-22 with the whole thing, because when I wouldn't identify it as a beginner text at all, because when you sort of look at it initially and you look at any of the pages, a lot of it is just like really long text walls of like or what looks like incomprehensible gibberish. But what they actually are the secret names of spirits and deities and entities and that kind of thing. And of course, the theory going is that you speak the names, and by speaking the name, you have power over the thing, or you have power with the thing, and then it brings it into manifestation, right? Or it brings it into result. And that's the thing. It does work, because that's the fascinating thing with it, and it is practical in its own way. Like, it is difficult to get it to work. I think it is a lot harder, mostly just because, again, there are so many purity procedures involved. There's like planetary timing and hours and that kind of thing, because it's all sort of carryovers from like Egyptian priesthood and that kind of thing, where they would have sacred bathing pools and stuff in the temples. So it's a bit harder to translate it into the modern day, but there are parallels between traditional witchcraft and the PGM. Absolutely. It's like even something like sympathetic magic, because we find like one of the most common forms of magic in late antiquity in general is curse tablets, right? So they're like little lead tablets that are inscribed on, and there are a good couple of pages in the PGM that actually detail the ritual, how those are created, and all the names and things that you write on it. And it's the same kind of idea. So even if you look at it from the correspondent and you break down that ritual, it's following those same methods, right? So you're using a specific metal, right? So a specific substance, usually lead, because it's very kind of it's a Saturnian working, right? It's to do with binding and coldness and density and earth, that kind of thing. Right. Then you're inscribing it with obviously the intention or the goal, so I guess the passion element of the ritual, right? And then you're inscribing the divine names or the secret names where you're calling on the entities. And then usually at the end of it, you'll go, it will tell you to go and bury it somewhere, which is symbolic itself, or it'll tell you to throw it down like a dark well or put it in a graveyard or somewhere spooky like that, because it's somewhere around spirits of the dead or anything that's Saturnian, right? But when you look at it, there are other elements of it, like things like baking puppets or dolls or fetish items and taglocks, where you sort of, you do actions on those things in the ritual. It's almost exactly in the same way as things you see in traditional craft as well. So it's the same method going over and over.
It does sound very similar. I know in our practice, I've come to use different words of power. And they're not necessarily names. When I was in the Hermetic order, especially if you read some of Crowley's, but also in the Hermetic order that I am involved with, which is Ogdoatic in its approach as opposed to Golden Dawn, they talk about words of power, and they say that usually these need to be in a language that you don't normally use. And that's why you'll see Hebrew used or whatever. And what I've come to start using in my practice is I will use Ancient Egyptian, and I like Gaelic. And I'll use those. But the whole point is you're building up this passion, this desire at the specific time when the tides are right. You have all of the resonating elements, the right colored candles or herbs. You're focusing on it. You've got a simple chant, which is very common in traditional witchcraft, is to just have a basic chant, nothing too elaborate, to help bring that state of mind, bring that passion up, get it there. But then at the key moment, you use a word of power to be the punctuating mark, the release of that energy, where your word is your bond and you're making it happen. And so what I found is I will use some Ancient Egyptian, as well as sometimes I'll use Gaelic terms. And I've found this to be a tremendous, for me personally, and it may not work for other people, for me personally, and our practice with our little small group here, to be highly effective. It seems to take the spell ritual to a different level of effectiveness. And I've seen very dramatic results on a practical level where when we use this technique, we've seen results within days on a practical, if we were working to bring something in. And so I guess that ties in. It's not the Greek magic papyri. I want to look more into that. I know, is it Stephen Skinner? Is that his name?
Stephen Skinner's done a lot of work on the PGM.
And I'm really curious to get some of his books on that.
He's another guest on this podcast actually. So in a couple of weeks you can tune back in, and I'll be having a conveation with him at some point.
I'm a fan. I'm a fan of his. I have been since the '70s when his book Techniques of High Magic came out. He's very knowledgeable.
So it's interesting. So when you were using these words of power, are they, I guess what we said, like, are they random words?
No. You look at
the language, or
words from language that have the meaning, that mean what we're doing. So if we're doing this for for example, when we're calling on the dragon's breath to bring the power in from the land, I'll use the term Anonothroch, which is Old Irish for serpent's breath. We'll use that instead of saying I call on the serpent's breath. Instead, we'll start chanting on Onathrak, on Onathrak.
Right.
And what it does is you're using something different, and it becomes almost a rhythm in your mind rather than a word. And it just puts you into that state of mind. And as you're out there under the full moon with just firelight and the candles, and you're chanting this thing, you can start to feel and see the energy just flowing into the area.
Yeah.
And then you have it, and then you can release it, and you can send it to whatever you're going to. I know in some prosperity rituals, what's the term? Bachau, Bachau. And all that means is prosperity and abundance in ancient Egypt. But you're doing this prosperity spell, and you're saying everything in English because that's the language I speak.
Sure.
And you're doing your chant, but then you start going Bachau, Bachau, prosperity and abundance, Bachau, over and over. It starts to just generate that inside of yourself. You're putting yourself, as you pointed out, so much of magic is internal. You're putting yourself in that state of mind that you're changing your state of consciousness so that you can merge with those forces and bring those into being on the astral, on their bread. You're bringing these forces into reality there so that they can then manifest on the material.
Yeah.
So the deeper you can put yourself in that state of mind, the better. And that's how I use those words of power. There are times when we do use actual names of deities. Julie was big on that. She, even though she was Basque, she and her family used Diana a lot. So we would be in ritual, and all of a sudden, I say all of a sudden, during part of the ritual, the women in the family would start singing the name Diana over and over in a sing-song rhythmic tone that was almost hypnotic, but it wasn't a chant. They were actually singing this, and it was just Diana over and over, and it would get louder and louder. And interestingly, the men did not. They stood there and we focused, but these women took charge, but hers was more matriarchal oriented.
Sure.
She was in charge of that group. Now, I don't know if that's changed since her passing, but in that case, they were using that name as a means to alter consciousness, but also as an evocation of that particular being. And now the Egyptian ones, I will use in some rituals an actual full-length incantation taken from the Temple of Dendera that calls on the goddess Hathor. And I say it in as close to ancient Egyptian as we know, because we don't know for sure how it was said.
Yeah.
But, I know what it means. And again, it puts you, you're not saying in English, so it puts you into a different state of mind because it's more the rhythm of the words.
Yeah.
And the idea. And I've found that helps in evoking her to our work. So that's how I use them.
That's absolutely fascinating. So it's. I mean, yeah. I guess this raises an interesting question, because you can go when you're in ritual and you are whether you're calling down calling down your patron or whatever your patron deity is, or your divine deity is, or you're calling on a specific entity. There are any number of incantations you can use, any number of hymns or ritual things, and maybe we can class that more as like devotional work rather than magical work, because you're kind of working with that. But so, do you think it would be fair? I mean, it's interesting. Do you think it would be fair to say the same kind of connection could be made purely by repeating the name or their name?
Well, Julia was. That's what they were doing.
So it was just Diana that they were saying.
Yeah, they did not have a long invocation, as I remember. And again, you're talking 40 some odd years ago.
Sure,
I did, but we were in the ritual, and suddenly one of the ladies, I think it was her daughter-in-law, began singing this name, and then her daughter started singing it. And then she started singing it, and it went around the room, and they got louder and fuller, and you could just feel the whole atmosphere in the room change. Yeah. And it was kind of course, I was young and impressionable, but it was kind of awe-inspiring because, and I almost felt a little not intimidated, but it was an odd feeling because you felt like you were in the presence of something else. So they were using it in that way. And this was just a group of people in street clothes in front of a fireplace. These were traditional witches. That's it. So they were using it in that way. You could use like one of Hathor's Ahuturu's names or titles. There's so many that she went by as in that way. Now, me personally, I think maybe it's because of my training in Hermetics, I like to do invocations. I really do. Yeah. I love the wordiness of it, and just as long as it's simple and direct, but I like to do that. And then I'll flow into using a word of power over and over. But as you saw in Horns of the Moon, there's times I do a lot of stuff in English, like what's the one I'm round and round throughout and about, the wheel weaves in and
yes.
Yeah, those things, I like that because it starts to flow almost like energy.
It's the alliteration that kind of it gets your head. Yeah.
And yet there were certain key words that we put into that resonate with the imagery of traditional witchcraft. There's the other one where we talk about 4 treasures hide in the keep, 4 realms the wise to seek.
Oh yes, the castle invocations and stuff. Yeah.
Yes. And so I enjoy the evocations and having that, but it's got to be something that each word has a meaning that triggers deep within you on many levels, so that you can move into that other state of mind. If you change your state of mind, you change your state of being. That's the one thing I've learned. And that comes really from Hermetics, because everything is alive, everything is consciousness. It's such an animistic approach to living.
Yeah.
But I'm firmly convinced that if you can change your state of consciousness, you can step beyond the limitations of this body.
Yeah.
You can step beyond that and begin to merge with and experience other realms. And that's where the techniques of traveling in spirit that I talk about in the book really take life and take hold. And that's how we get into that whole process of meeting other world beings.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I'm babbling on. I'm just babbling on. You got me going here.
Trust me, this podcast is going to be full of babble, and I absolutely love it. Don't ever apologize for it. But yeah, I mean, in terms of in my mind right now, I'm trying to think of. I'm always trying to relate things back to the practical, or back to like if someone was coming into witchcraft for the first time, So in that sense, when we're using words of power or we're using incantations, whether it's to stir the cauldron, raise energy in places, or connect with deities. I know you talk about this at one section in Horns of the Moon, but it's not just saying the word, right? But you go with that. There is also an emotional element to it, and I guess there's also a visualization element that comes to it as well, right?
Absolutely. I think that's a thing that a lot of people miss. So many books say this thing, light this candle, and you're done.
Yeah.
The key is everything's internal.
Right.
That candle is just an outward expression of an inner thought or reality. You have to have that. And let's talk about imagination versus fantasy and how imagination plays into occult work. And this is something that the Grand Master of our Hermetic Order really stressed. He says, imagination is the faculty of the mind to be able to shape or perceive energies on different levels. It's not fantasy. You're reading a good book or you're watching a movie, that's fantasy. It's there to entertain. It's there to, just pass the time, and we all have fantasies about things. That's fantasy. Imagination is when you use that quality or that part of your ability to shape energies, to give it a matrix to take form on the astral, in various forms. Anything we do in life, we have to imagine first. If you want to make this cup, first you have to imagine the cup. What does it look like? What's it going to be? Then you draw it out. You make a plan. Then you get the materials and you make it. You imagined it. You imaged it into reality. And so when you're doing magic, when you're doing a spell, these items are extensions of those forces. When you imagine your goal, you're pulling through that energy from these different tides of power, whether it's planetary or solar or whatever, elemental. You're pulling those through and using your passion as well, and then using your imagination to be the image maker, the matrix that energy is going to take form on. And that's so critical for students to understand, and most don't. They have to get past that. The other thing is when you're holding those tools, that knife, that cup, that candle, they are not symbolic. They are not symbolic. It's so hard for people to understand that. I've got this symbol of, this talisman is a symbol of Jupiter. This talisman is a symbol. It is not. It is an extension of it. That wand is an extension of your will. That knife is extension of your intellect. That cup is extension of your passion. You need to understand, not you personally, but the witch needs to understand that.
Well, I think I'm probably good at it. I think I'm probably doing learning it myself and regrounding it. But go on.
But it's such a hard thing for people to understand, and it wasn't until I finally grasped that internally that my magic was hit or miss. But once you realize, no, these are real. These are real extensions. The words I'm saying, yes, they're symbols, but they're symbols of an inner thought, a reality that I'm trying to convey. And so they have meaning. And in fact, I could argue that they are extensions of those inner thoughts of reality. And so they are those thoughts of reality. So that's why you'll find that a lot of witches, integrity, honesty, at least traditional witches, those are key factors, because when you're in a spell, you're doing a spell, your words mean what they have to mean. Right. Your words, you can't mumble, you can't exaggerate. You have to be very clear, because words are real. Words have power. And so I think that's why when you talk about inner visualization, I think a lot of the new people that get into this think, it's a symbol of this. I just say this thing. They're not understanding what's going on inside of them. They have to have real passion. They have to have real desire. The goal has to be within the realm of availability. It can't be something, they can't say, I want to be president of the United States and never have held office, unless you're
like have no political background or anything.
Right. You have to make sure you have the passion, you have the drive, you can clearly envision it, it's within your realm of availability, and then you can start to make it happen. But that spell then becomes that extension of that force to make it happen. And you're creating it on different levels, what Victorian era occultists would call the astral, which we call the abred. You're making it on this different level so that it can then manifest on the material. And that's the theory behind it, and it works.
I remember one of the things I think it's in one of the early chapters in Haunts of the Moon, where you sort of bring attention back to, again, the principle of polarity, so from the Kabbalah. And the way you put it was absolutely brilliant to me, where if you think of the difference between sort of your current position and whatever your manifestation or the result of a ritual is, it's a spectrum more than anything. It's just like, it's two polarities, where what you're actually doing in a magical ritual or in any kind of ritual is you're just moving yourself along the spectrum more towards whatever your goal is, and that's kind of, it's such a different approach, because I think where most people, especially if you come at it from a lot of the newer spiritual communities, and we have all these ideas about the law of attraction or manifestation, anything that kind of thing, it's kind of, I feel like people are under the impression that they're creating things from nothing, or that they're kind of like, when they come in, they manifest something. It's like, I'm manifesting abundance. And it's like, well, no, like you are on you're on a spectrum right now. And when you're dealing with this kind of magic, what you're doing in reality is you are shifting your own personal energy or your own personal space on that spectrum closer to an outcome that you want, or closer to an outcome of whatever it is. And you do that through all of these sort of correspondences and all of these things. They are the tools you can use to move your consciousness along to one side or the other of the spectrum. Everything.
Yeah. I would agree. I think that's where a lot of students, apprentices fail in their magic, is they shoot too big. You need to set the circumstances over time. So in the new book, I talk about prosperity magic. I'm so shocked at so many seasoned occultists who will not teach magic for prosperity purposes. They say it should not be used for personal gain. That's nonsense. I mean, this, again, let's go back to the country witch. This was how they survived. You went out and you slaughtered the chicken for dinner. You had to do this. You needed to get that. It was all about survival, fertility. Today, it's about financial success. We survive through financial success. So I think it's essential to practice prosperity magic. But in the book, I talk about how you want to set yourself up for that. And first is make sure your area is protected. Get negativity out of your life. Then start setting up those things that resonate with abundance. Plant different herbs and have different talismans in the home that resonate with those forces that bring abundance, with Jupiter, with the sun, whatever, to help bring that through. Then start fine-tuning your magic towards specific goals. But you want to set yourself up so that it just naturally starts to come. Like there's that resonance, that tone, and then work even deeper as you go. Don't just suddenly say, I'm going to do this spell right now to win the lottery, and it better work. Well, you and 500,000 other people are trying that very same thing. Instead, another thing is a lot of people try to be very specific. I want this money to come from this source at this time in this place, or whatever it is, love or whatever. And I've come to the conclusion over a lot of years that it's a lot easier just to put it out there that you want money or abundance to come to you, that you want love or whatever to come to you, and let it manifest as best it can. Magic is like water. It follows the lines of least resistance. I've seen this so many times. I will be expecting it to come from this source over here, and some opportunity out of the blue that I didn't even know about, boom, pops up, and it was 10 times better than what I thought I was going to get. And this happened just recently with me. I was doing a lot of prosperity spells, but just I wanted prosperity. And I figured I'd be getting it from my present job because that's my source. It's my realm of availability. Suddenly, a company out of the blue, never heard of, contacted me, made a tremendous offer, one my current company could not match. And I've said, fine. And that was right after doing some prosperity spells using, as a matter of fact, some of those Gaelic terms part of the way that I went into that state of being, that state of becoming. So it all ties back, but I'm babbling again.
No, I love it. No, it's interesting. I'm in a weirdly similar boat, to be honest. So I recently started. So I recently started Mistai, which is this company that we're working at now. So we're like brand new. We started like 2 months ago, pretty much. Or I started the company like 2 months ago, and it's always one of those difficult things. Starting any kind of startup company from scratch is never easy, right? And especially starting one that's to do with witchcraft is not. It's not like even in there. It's a difficult thing to do with the marketing and the business side of things, everything like that. But I remember I put the intention out. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned actually because I don't even remember doing a specific ritual for it. This is the thing. Like I didn't actually sit down and do a prosperity ritual, like a structured formal ritual. I set my ritual space up and I set my house up in general, whether it's with altar statues that are to do with sort of wealth, financial currents, that kind of thing, or Jupiter talismans or tin metals, those kinds of things in my house and those kind of places. And it's interesting looking at it that I'll tell you about. I did Jupiter and I also did like Mercury things. So things that are to do with like communication as well, like creating new opportunities, that kind of thing. And it's just funny to me how it works because like 2 months ago when we had started, we had absolutely nothing. And then now after a month or so of doing or setting up my space and setting up my life in general to attract those kind of opportunities, I'm at a point where basically every author on that lower bookshelf is now scheduled for a podcast.
Oh, awesome. That's way cool.
Which is like completely mind-blowing to me because on the one hand, like I've grown up with all of these guys.
Right.
So it's like on my side of it, it's like I'm basically interviewing like my teachers and my idols for all of this. And like you don't expect any of them to come back, right? Like I send out emails. Like I sent an email out to you. I was not expecting you to come back to me at all. But then you did. And it's like, oh wow, this is great. And now like we're here and it's doing this kind of thing. It's that same process that happens where it's like you would tune yourself even before doing a formal ritual. You would tune yourself to that current,
Yeah.
And then it actually, again, because like you said, magic is like water. It follows the path of least resistance. What you're doing as you're building yourself up to it is you are just decreasing the friction, right? Or you're decreasing the resistance that creates around you. Where in comparison to if you don't do any work or preparatory, I guess you could even call it preparatory immersion, right? You're immersing yourself into that kind of current or whatever it is your intention is before the ritual, and doing that versus just like on a whim deciding that you want to do a particular ritual one day and going in and just like going at it with like full force, or like a full on like mallet trying to hit your goal or whatever, right? In comparison to slowly building up and bending the reality around you, or attuning yourself to reality, and then maybe doing a ritual as like the culminating point, in the same way as you talked about with the with the words of power, right? You go through various incantations and then you release the word of power at the end as the kind of big aha moment.
Right.
You can apply it on like a macro scale to like ritual.
I agree. There's a couple points I want to make sure the listeners understand, though. Once you do that big spell, once you reach that, boom, you have to let go. You have to step away from it and let it do its thing. So many people don't. They go, I wonder if it's going to work. Is it going to work? What's going on?
Right.
And they worry and fret about it. Or they'll say, well, maybe I should do it again right now. And all that does is put a drag on it. You have to divorce yourself from it and just say, let it go, walk away. Don't worry about it. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. If it doesn't, well, then I'll figure out what I did wrong. But you let it go. Now, the question becomes, how long do you wait to see if you get results? Sybil, in her books, said that generally you should wait at least a lunar month. Julie never really said. I've found times it depended on what I was doing. It really did. Now, if I'm doing a specific work on a specific person to make them do a specific thing, I will often do what Julie called a drum roll, where I'll do it and I'll let it go, but then I'll wait until a similar tide of power will come up. So that could be, if it's early part of waxing moon, could be the next week where it's just before the full moon and it's a Thursday, whatever it was, I might do it again. A case in point, here's a situation where you don't necessarily have to build up towards this stuff. When we were in North Carolina, and I was fairly new at all this, but I look back and go, that was pretty good. I had just gotten a job. This was the Bible Belt in 1980. Okay, 1982, something like that. The Bible Belt. And I just gotten a job. And we had started our coven. We were guests, and people were starting to get used to who we were. And I didn't want my boss to find out through the grapevine. It's a little small town. On top of it, the woman I was with had been invited to speak to the Samhain seminar in El Paso, Texas. El Paso? Yes, El Paso. Anyway, and I wanted to go. And I just got this job. What do I do? So got a tag lock on the boss, and I did a Mercury ritual on him, and I did it 3 nights in a row. So it was a drum roll, what we call a drum roll. So I did it 3 times, bam, bam, bam. Then I let go. I waited a week, and then I went in and sat down, introduced myself because we barely talked, and I explained that I was part of a witchcraft coven in town, and that I know I was new to the job, but I really enjoyed it. And by the way, I have to go to the seminar in Texas, but I wanted him to hear it from me. And the guy was totally stunned, but he looked at me and said, I appreciate what you told me. Let me have the time off. The problem is my ritual was so-and-so's name. Listen well. Hearken to this witch's spell. By swiftness of Mercury, power of air, you will know that I am there. I am your equal, strong and proud. So-and-so, respect me now. That was the chant. I still remember. I wrote it down all these years. That was 40 years ago. But that was the chant. And he was a Virgo, so I wanted to use Mercury.
Sure.
And I know Virgos really, if you can gain their respect, then you can have them. So that's what I did. Well, I come back from the seminar. What's happened? I was just a packer in the warehouse. He's moved my workstation next to his. He's giving me new duties. Then he starts taking me to lunch and teaching me all about the business. I was like 23, 24, and he's, he was treating me like a partner. And it was just like, if I'd wanted to fly under the radar and just be this guy who was in the warehouse that was in some weird cult, that wasn't going to happen. Because of the wording in the spell, he now treated me as his equal, as his partner. So there's a lesson for people that, one, you don't have to necessarily gear up. You can do something bam hard and do it. You can do things over a period of time, but you have to let go. But be careful of what you do. Be careful of your wording, because the words formed the image that allowed the power to manifest. And I put it directly into his mind. And it was kind of fun, but it was like, what the hell did I do?
Yeah, it's one of those like big like oh crap moments. Like
yeah, I mean, it was really good. It was the guy was a great guy. Turns out I didn't know it, but he was into the Masons, and so he was. So
like, I suppose he had like a background in it. Or
but I had no knowledge of that. To me, he was just the owner of this small company I was working at. It was kind of funny. But I wanted to point out, though, the reason I said that is because I talked about how having this resonance and building up, you don't have to necessarily do that. This thing was a spur of the moment thing. Like, what am I going to do? God, I want to go to this seminar. He's going to find out I'm in some witch cult. I better talk to the guy. How do I do this? This is the Bible Belt. What do I do? So I'll just zap him. So, that's practical witchcraft, and that's why I like traditional witchcraft and practical magic,
right?
Because it's for that type of thing. And if anybody says you shouldn't use it for personal gain, I don't agree. This is survival. We are in the 21st century. We survive by making money, and so magic is magic.
Right. I suppose that's It's. I mean, I guess this is part of a slightly wider discussion. Or just I think the attitude towards what a lot of modern spiritual circles have towards money and financial gain, right? Because there is, especially in sort of modern spiritual circles, I found it especially when you're starting like a spiritual themed business, there is where the majority of your revenue, I guess you could say, comes from quote unquote spiritual sources, right? Or any kind of thing like that. There is a kind of a weird mindset that exists with people where they think that it's kind of impossible to have both, right? Where it's like you can't be or you can't use spirituality for money, or that money and materiality don't mix with spiritual philosophy. And I think most of it ultimately comes from that whole thing of, because a lot of our sort of mainstream Western spirituality that we see comes from, maybe like Buddhist or Vedic sources, where that whole idea of detachment from the physical world is pressed a lot. It's kind of an interesting discussion, but actually what you're saying actually makes perfect sense to me, where it's like, witchcraft especially, it's related to survival, and the modern mask of survival ultimately is finance, right?
Well, as in traditional witchcraft, as it's been taught to me, life is an adventure. We're here to experience this. This is the universe experiencing itself. You and I are the consciousness of the universe. All of a sudden the universe has become aware of itself. It's supposed to be fun. You're supposed to enjoy it. There's nothing in traditional witchcraft that says you can't enjoy sex. You can't enjoy having a drink. There's nothing in that. You need to have balance and harmony so you don't harm yourself or others. But we're meant to experience this. We're meant to. And these religions and philosophies that try to divorce it and say, that's evil, that's bad, you need to go off into some etheric spiritual realm, I disagree. I think every single realm is equally spiritual. This realm material here, this is just as spiritual as anything that the different gods may more regularly manifest on. They're not in a more spiritual realm. It's just a different realm that they're able to manifest easier in. I don't believe this good, bad, up, down. That's why I understand the Kabbalah very well, but I don't like the Tree of Life, because it's this top-down, fallen worlds, sin ladder. Oh my God, we've got to climb the ladder and get to Kether. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. I would put it on its side And I'd say there's a spectrum like light.
Yeah.
Not a good light or a bad light. You got red over here, you got purple over here, you got all this in between. Is purple good and red is bad? Well, they eventually merge. So wait a minute.
Right. They're all part of the same spectrum. Yeah.
Right. You know, our world is what we make it. Right now, we've made a mess of it as humans. We've made a mess of it, and we're going to pay a price for it. But is it evil? Is it bad? Is sex bad? How can it be bad? It's how everything gets here. So that's why when you say this spiritual, that you got to divorce yourself from the material, that's how these religions look at it. Fine, that's their view. I don't agree. I totally don't agree. Now, I do think you have to have a strong moral code of when approaching this, because money can corrupt people. I mean, you look at any of the big churches or world religions, and it has corrupted people. There are less evolved people in every walk of life, in every religion, every philosophy. You're going to find people in traditional witchcraft that are very, in my opinion, very low morals. But I think every person in and of themselves needs to have that inner compass of what is right and wrong for them and for the people around them. Are they harming people? Are they doing the right thing? And that's where Julie really strongly talked about this. Again, she felt that the witch, and what she meant was people within her family, people in traditional witchcraft, had to live at a higher standard, or a stricter standard or moral compass than she used to say than the average pagan, because she was very familiar with the pagan community out there in California. And she said that we absolutely have to. And she strongly had that a certain set of, not tenets, she used to call them councils of the wise. And that's in the Willow Path. I don't know if you've read that one, but I did put them in there. And Sybil Leek had the same basic tenets. She called them tenets, but I know of another group from the 70s. This was located in Boston, and I have a mammogram from them, monogram, where they had the same, almost word for word, councils. They called them councils of the wise. So you do. I do think that if you're going to start a business, look for personal gain through spiritual means, through magical means, you got to have a certain moral compass. You're not going to take advantage of people. You're not going, you want to, but you have to meet your material needs. You still have to have food on your table and a house over here, and a roof over your head. You still have to have all that. So, So, anyway, I'm babbling again. Here we go.
No, I'm loving it. It's good. No, it's all good. So I mean, I guess we can sort of start. I mean, how long will we be going now? Nearly 2 hours, 20 minutes. So I guess we can.
Hasn't been long,
yeah. We can. I guess we could start wrapping up as we're going along. I guess this would be a good natural stopping point. But I mean, let's go back to, I think if people are getting into witchcraft as a whole, let's say traditional witchcraft, because we're wanting to make it practical and narrow our scope a little bit. What are, if I don't know, let's say like 3, 5, I don't know, a random arbitrary number. What are some of the sort of the central tenets or central things you think people should know when it comes to doing practical witchcraft? Whether it's getting results in ritual, working with entities, the philosophy you take, anything like that. Are there any sort of really sort of ground like pillars of witchcraft that you would sort of give to new practitioners or anything like that? I know that's a bit of like a very loaded question, isn't it? But
it's all very nature-based. Traditional witchcraft is get into nature. So many people, especially in New England, is so crowded. I'm sure it is in London, and these people, they need to get out into nature. There's no substitute for it. You can be an urban witch. You got to get out into nature. And I don't mean an occasional walk in the park. I mean, you need to spend time out there because something happens. And I know this from personal experience. When I was doing ceremonial magic in my attic in the middle of a town, there was a whole different feeling than when I was out in the forest, miles away from anybody, and you start trying to do some of these techniques and things happen, but it's very different. These spirits, these forces are there, they're real, and they will begin to work with you and communicate with you. And you'll begin to open up to that. You'll find that the energies, the information that starts to flow. Traditional witchcraft is very experiential. You look at some of the old records on familiar spirits. What's her name? Wembley? I can't remember the name, but her book on Isabel Goody, to talk about the familiar spirits that would come to these different people on their own in nature. And that's exactly what happens. It does. That would be the first one. Two, be patient. Don't be hard on yourself. You're going to want to run. You can't. Take your time.
Yeah.
And then do the study, do the research, read everything. Particularly any of the books from Troy publishers are very good. Those folks have really taken the time to devote themselves to this form of the magical art.
Yeah. I think I have pretty much like everything from Troy's back catalog at this point. I'm like working my way up. It's such good material. I love it. So
It is. I mean, there's some that I go, but the vast majority of it is just really good, sound, folkloric magic. But read everything. Don't be afraid to practice. Invite these beings into your life. Don't be afraid of them. There's nothing to be afraid of, but be mature about it, just like you would when you meet a stranger. And get into nature. Those would be the key points. They really are. But that's a good start.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, as an example of it off the top of my head, this is well, because I remember one of the things that I very, very early on, when I first sort of got out into nature, one of my first intentions was finding any kind of familiar spirit. Because I think one of the it's actually interesting. This harkens back to our conversation about the Greek magical papyri. It's actually kind of interesting. The Greek magical papyri is an enormous body of work. There are tons of papyrus, but it's interesting. I think I genuinely believe this is completely deliberate on the part of the scribe who wrote this. But the first spell that exists in the PGM, like PGM 1, line 1, whatever it is, like the absolute opening of the entire PGM is a ritual for acquiring a familiar. It's they call it a paradros. It's a Greek word that basically means near-sider or near-sided one, like or sitting or being that sits beside. Basically, it is the official translation. Okay. But the very, very first ritual in the entire papyrus is a right to acquire what they say is an assistant daimon or assistant quote unquote demon, right? But demon was just a general word that meant spirit back in those days, right? But I think it's significant that the opening ritual in the entire corpus is acquiring a familiar, and while that's definitely a way bigger discussion about acquiring familiars and what exactly they are and how to work with those kind of things. Do you think there is any kind of what is the introductory way that we can go about, or a beginner witch or something can go about inviting these kinds of entities in and actually beginning to work with them? Like, is it just, well, I say just, but doing the rituals and saying the incantations and maybe choosing a patron to work with and calling them in? Or do you think maybe it's better initially to just go out into nature and see what entities are there? But then how do you go about actually calling them in, if that makes sense?
Sure. It depends on which approach you're taking. Now, if you're doing the Egyptian approach, which isn't traditional witchcraft, it is about doing the rituals. It is about working with specific Neteru, different gods or goddesses. And that can be extremely powerful and fulfilling. That is not traditional witchcraft, though in my practice, I will incorporate it into my traditional witchcraft. But that's one method that I used very successfully back in the early 90s. And it's very powerful. So that if you're more inclined toward that, or if you're living in a city setting, that might be the way to go, because these entities work on more of a, I hate to use the term, but I guess celestial level rather than out in the land.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
You're looking at traditional witchcraft. You got to find a place that really that when you're out in that place, that you can feel it, that it is unmistakable, that it just overwhelms you. The natural pulse of the land just overwhelms you. We've all been to those places, whether it's a rugged seacoast or there's a place up here in the White Mountains of New Hampshire called Franconia Notch. And you drive through this, and it's two huge mountains, and the feeling in between there is unmistakable. It just is overwhelming. Yep. The power there is just such that you can tell it's a liminal place where the worlds cross over and interpenetrate. That's what you're looking for. If you're going to get into traditional witchcraft, find those liminal places in nature that just totally wow you, totally overwhelm you. It could be even something simple. I know on our property, I've found a number of crevices and small caves. There's a cliff that goes up one side that's about 30 feet high, and there's a long streak of white quartz all the way through it. There's places like that. Find those liminal places in nature that you can go to on a regular basis. Then you can do rituals there, or you can just open yourself up. I know Gemma in her book, Cornish Book of Ways, Traditional Witchcraft, she talks about just going and sitting and being quiet in those places and letting those forces come through. And for me, I was deeply into Hermetics when we moved up to the White Mountains, even though I had all this, the mountain up here, even though I had all this experience from Julie. But we started spending every weekend up at this property deep in the woods, off grid. And that's when things started happening. Over time, just everything changed. And I found I started abandoning the Hermetic rituals, because we were outside nature, and started creating a circle out of stone. And it just started to organically come, plus using various rituals. And I think I have a number of them in the 2 books I put out so far, and I'm going to have more. So, but that's the key. Is if you want to do traditional witchcraft, get into a liminal place, some place that you can actually feel it, and you'll know it. I mean, you're psychologically going to say, well, it's because the ocean is pounding against the sea and it's really beautiful. Well, that could be part of it, but there's something more going on there. Just let yourself go with it. Even if it is psychological, so what? Who cares? You're experiencing is your reality, and you're going to find that it opens those doors between worlds. It really does, and those spirits will come through. That's the best way to open that dialogue. Then once it starts happening, your mind's going to say to yourself, is this real, or am I making this up? When I started working with my all-room root, it's a ash root, similar to mandrake, but it's made out of ash tree. The specific ritual, I give the ritual in the Willow path, but it was to attract a familiar spirit and bring her or him into that root. But as you do it and you work with this, you can feel it, you can see it, it's there. And yet part of you goes, because of our conditioning in our current modernistic materialistic society, you're going, is this real, or am I just playing with a wooden doll? Is this real or not? But you have to just for a minute, while you're doing that, while you're working with it, suspend any disbelief. Just let go. For right now, why not? Okay, it's real. Later your critical mind can take over and say, I don't know, I'm not sure. That's fine. Are you getting results? You start working with this familiar. You go through the rite. You draw the familiar into the root. You have this. Now you're doing spells. You ask your familiar to go to the person and make such and such happen. Boom. A phone call comes from that person, and you have the job or whatever it was you were doing. Now something happened there. You talk to your wooden doll that critically is not real. You're totally making this up, but it worked. So it's real. That's the trick, is we have to drop our materialistic era iPad phone mentality. Get rid of that and say, at least for this time being, I'm going to say this is real and see what happens. And you'll be surprised. It works. The stuff works. There is another reality beyond what our materialistic society has even begun to imagine.
Absolutely. And I think I guess this is like an excellent point to end on, actually. But I think, and this is something that I was talking about on another podcast the other day with somebody, but I think and I mean this can apply to any form of spiritual practice, I think, but the absolute best measure of proof that we can have that these things exist is personal practice or personal experience of them, because you can read every single book. People can spend 2 hours, 2.5 hours of their time listening to our amazing discussion. They can do everything and read every book and watch every video, whatever it is. But until they do the rituals, until they do the experiences, until they have the experiences, they will not understand it. Yeah. But I think that's what makes it so much fun to me. That's what makes it so exciting to me, because it's like, it's the ultimate measure of like, it's like if someone asks me and they're like, is magic real? I'm just like, go and see, like, go and find out. And it's the funniest thing to me, because people, even if they come at it from a negative perspective, and people come at me, they're like, well, witchcraft isn't real, magic isn't real. I'll go back at them and I'll be like, okay, have you tried it? Have you done the ritual? Have you set the candles out? Have you set the incense out? Have you gone into nature? Have you done all of this stuff? And then they'll be like, no, because it's not real. It's like, okay, but do you see, like, do you see the issue here? It's like you're denying something that you have no experience of, but when you get experience of it, that's when things change.
A fun thing to say to somebody like that is say, okay, well then you won't mind giving me some of your hair and your handwriting, will you? You'll say, oh well, I can't do that. But I do want to, and bring it back to the people that are just starting out at Tik Tok, which is whatever. I have to say, they are doing it. They're going out and trying it. They are. They're not an armchair occultist that's read all probably and they can spout all this stuff. But those folks can't do a thing because they're afraid to, or they're too lazy to. But you got a teenager who sees something on TikTok, gets a candle. They're doing it, and they're going to get results at some point.
Yeah.
And I have so much respect for that, because I was there. I remember when I was a teenager and I did my first love spell. I got this thing, oh boy, and it worked. It's so you do have to get out there and you do have to do it. And that's what brings the reality of it and brings the experience and carries you to the next level. It really does.